ahead and let's get started. This is well, probably the most difficult of the five lectures that we've done, primarily because it's even for me, much of what I'm going to be introducing today is brand new. And though some of it you will see is review from the other lectures, the majority of what I'm going to introduce you've not seen before. I didn't even know about this material prior to June of this year. So this is all coming out in this year, and it's 2020 is going to be an exciting year for, well, for us. It's not going to necessarily be known by most of the world as an exciting year. They'll know it as the pandemic. Others will know it as the election here in the United States. But for those of us working in Islam, I don't think we have come across this much new material in 1 year like we have in the last 40 that I've been working, at least. And there is a reason for that. Some of it is because of the pandemic. I don't want to blame it on the pandemic. We've had to stay at home. We've had to do an awful lot more research, and we are in much more communication. This word Zoom, I think, is now on everybody's dictionary. We all know what that means. But prior to March of this year, probably most of you probably didn't even know what Zoom was. Beth and I have been using Zoom for what now? I think now about 7 or 8 years in our Fander and now the One Truth Project course that she is now heading up. And so Zoom has been something, a vehicle that we have used for so long, and that has created an opportunity this year where we're getting lots of scholars who are now connecting with us, mainly because we're putting this new research up onto Fander Films. And once it's on Fander Films, anybody can watch it. People are getting in contact with us, and they're saying, have you looked at this inscription? Have you looked at this article? How about this coin? Look and take a look at these documents that have come up. And so because of that, we're getting an enormous amount of help from outside experts. The numismatists have really helped me out. These are numismatists who started engaging with me in January of this year because of some videos I put up looking at the coins at the British Museum. And noticing that there was one coin that had been misnamed and also had been misdated. And so as a result of that, they contacted me. They said, look at this coin. These are numismatists who understand these coins and they even have them in their collections. But they could not understand how to interpret what they were looking at. And this is what I would say the Islamic dance. I call it the Islamic dance. This is what the problem we're all involved with and we're all controlled by. All of us have only had one narrative, and I'm going to talk more about this as I get into the lecture. And that narrative has only come from the traditions from the 9th and 10th century, and we have therefore looked and been forced to interpret everything we're looking at from that dance. And so we've danced that dance because there's been no other dance, there's been no other narrative, there's been no other category to interpret what we're looking at. And the numismatists showed me this in about February or March this year. I realized that they're still imposing the Islamic narrative on those coins. And so I told them, throw away the Islamic narrative, completely throw it away, and just look at the coins. Look at the coins now and tell me what you see. Tell me what you read. What is it? Help me here. You tell me what's on those coins. And that's why they've been a great help. This is the same thing with the inscriptions. We have found out with the rock inscriptions, especially the rock inscriptions. We didn't understand them until we threw out the tradition and started looking them anew. And so this is what I'm not going to be introducing the coins today. We've done a whole lecture on the coins, so I'm not going to get into that at the moment. But what I'm going to do is show you that almost everything that we're looking at is not from the perspective of the Islamic tradition. So let's, with any further ado, let's go ahead and open up the PowerPoint and let's share screen, and I'll start with what I want to talk about today. And it is the quest. I mean, this is what I'm calling this. I call these lectures the 5Q lectures because they all begin with Q. Well, at least to me, they begin with Q. And this is the last one, the quest. And what are we looking at? We're looking for anything that is Islamic in the 7th century. We're looking and asking, is there anything back here in the 7th century that we can identify as Islamic? Is a person named Muhammad here? Can we find a place called Mecca here? Can we find the people called Muslims here? Is there a religion called Islam? Is there a Quran, a book called the Quran in the 7th century, at least prior to 690, prior to the last decade of the 7th century? And by the title, you might say, is The Road Least Traveled. And I'm finding that I have to go that road. That is one line. It's not the correct line, but you'll see it's one line from David Frost's poem that I'm going to talk about in just a few seconds. So let's go right into the question. Let's talk about and let's see what we now find. To do this, I'm going to look at 4 areas. As I've always said, if if you want to confront Islam, you've got to look at the book, the man, and the place. So we're going to look at the problems concerning these areas. What we're going to find is almost everything that we have looked up to date is either too late or too distant. They're going to delve into the book itself, and some of this it comes from the last two lectures that we've been doing the last 2 weeks. We're going to look at just a quick overview of the manuscripts and the get up problem to show you that there is a real problem here, understanding not only because everything is so late, but it is also much too distant. We then move into the man himself. They seek him here, they seek him there, they seek him everywhere. That damn impossible Pimpernel, and that's from the line, the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is the problem that we're finding with Muhammad. We just can't find him. We're seeking him here, we're seeking him there, we're seeking him everywhere, but we just can't seem to get a hold of where he is. However, I think we have found him, and we're going to introduce that today. We think we know who this Muhammad is that the traditions refer to. And then we're going to finish with the place. This is the third major category that we're going to look at today. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Last Battle, talks about the people in the story coming up to this wall on top of a hill, and there's a gate there, and as they go into it, they are told to go further up and further in. Well, I'm going to say for my categories here, to understand where Islam is, you need to go further up and further north, and you're going to see that over and over again, that word north appear. I've underlined it in many of the slides just to bring that point home, because almost everything we're going to look at today comes from the north. It does not come from the Hijaz. It does not come from the place it should. And then we're going to come to our conclusions and bring it all together and try to make sense of what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and let's ask what the Muslims claim. And this is what they claim. They claim that the Jews and the Christians corrupted their book and their God. Therefore, Muhammad was sent to correct that corruption and received that revelation between 610 and 632, they say. He lived in a place called Mecca and then moved to Medina in 622. And that book that was given him between 610 and 632, the book called the Quran, as we know today, has not changed. Not one word, not one letter has changed in 1400 years. And Mecca, the place where he was born, the place where he spent until the year 622, is still the center of the world and the center of history. That's what they claim. So let's just take a look at how they would say Islam began. This is from their narrative. This is the classical narrative. This is from the traditions. This is what all Muslims, well, I would say 99% of all Muslims, this is how they would claim. They would say that Muhammad was born in 570, that the Quran received the Quran, started receiving the Quran in 610. That continued up until 622. However, before that, he was sent up to the seven heavens after he was woken up in the middle of the night and told to get on the back of the winged horse called the Buddha, flew up to Jerusalem, and there he then ascended the seven heavens, met Allah, who told him to pray 50 times a day, came down to the fifth heaven. Moses was there and says, hold on a minute, that's way too many prayers. See if you can get it back down. So he bounces back and forth between the seventh and the fifth heaven, getting the prayers from 50 to 45 down to 15, 10 down to 5 prayers. And then he returns back down to Jerusalem, having finally given the permission to do so by Moses, flies back down to Mecca, and that's called the Mi'raj. And that happens in 621. 622, then he moves with about 80, maybe 200, we don't really know the exact number, but of these muhajirun, these people that are part of the hijrah. And this is called the hijrah, the exodus from Mecca to Medina, up to Medina, and he takes over there in Medina from 622 onward, and then receives the Medinan revelations. And when you look at the Quran, that's the first part of the Quran, the first roughly half of the Quran. He then comes and takes over Mecca without firing a shot in 630, and then he dies in 632. Well, that's his life. So you can put that in the red line there. That's Muhammad's life. 570, 632. No reason to dispute that. No reason to look for any other life of him, because this is the only one we've been given. This is the only one we know. This is the only one that's taught in our schools, in our seminaries, in our Bible schools, and our universities. We're then told that after he died in 632, Abu Bakr comes and he reigns for only 2 years. He dies peacefully, so he only doesn't reign very long. And Umar then takes over, and he reigns from 634 to 644, 10 years. He is killed, but under his rulership, you have the huge expansion, and they move over to the west, as far as, well, almost to Tripoli, and to the east, almost as far as Afghanistan. So the expansion really takes place during his rule, that 10-year rule. After he is killed, then Uthman comes to power, and he rules from 644 to 656. This is what the traditions tell us. Now, during his lifetime, you have then the second compilation of the Quran. I should have said earlier that under Abu Bakr, we have the first compilation. That's the first time the Quran was compiled. We're going to talk more about that later. The second time it was compiled is during the time of Uthman, roughly around 652, about 20 years later. Then he is killed, and Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, then takes over, and he rules for about 5 years before he is killed by Muawiyah and the Umayyads. The Umayyads come in after that. So there is the emergence of Islam, that as the Islamic traditions tell us. 570 to 632 is the life of Muhammad. Then you have Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the four rightly guided caliphs. That's known, well, roughly the period from 624 up to 661 is known as the Rashidun period. That is known as the golden period of Islam. That is what a lot of Muslims would like to get back to, that era, that period, that type of life. And so that's the Islamic traditions. Now, the problem with those, everything I've just told you in the last 5 minutes, everything I've just told you comes from sources that are much too late and far too distant. Let me just go again. Let's just take a look at where this story comes from, where this narration or where this narrative comes from. We know that Muhammad dies in 632, right? That's what they all say. No one disputes that. At least today, till today, we've not really disputed that. So his biography, his life comes from this man here, Ibn Ishaq, who dies in 765. 632, 765. That's 130 years later. That should concern you. But it concerns me anyhow. It concerns me. Why does it take them to 135 years to basically write down his biography? And take a look at where he's living. He's living in 765. That means he is living within the Abbasid period. I'm going to talk about the Abbasids quite a bit today, and you'll see why. But we don't really have anything from Ibn Ishaq. We're dependent on this guy here, Ibn Hisham, to find out about Muhammad's life. So he dies in 833, and he takes what he likes of Ibn Ishaq and throws away the less. So he doesn't really retain much of Ibn Ishaq's material. So let's get rid of Ibn Ishaq. Since we don't have his material, since we don't know really what he said, we're totally dependent on Ibn Hisham, let me say that correctly, Ibn Hisham, for the biography of Muhammad. That's roughly 200 years after the fact. There's another one that writes a biography. His name is Al-Waqidi, and he dies in 835. So that's the Sirah. That's the biography of Muhammad. What about the sayings, the hadith? Well, the hadith are first written down by this man, al-Bukhari. And look at his date, 870. So he is the one that is given 600,000 of these akhbars. He's told to go through them and to throw away those which don't make any sense. And he does that. He wills them, he throws all the way down to 7,397. So roughly 7,400. He retains. That's just 2% of 600,000. So he throws away 98% and only retains 2%. And he is the first to have done this. So he is the one that really is the name that we hear for the hadith. He is the first to really compile these hadith in 870. There's others that come after him. You have Sahih Muslim, who dies in 875. You have At-Tirmidhi, who dies in 844. Ibn Majah, who dies in 877. Abu Dawud, who dies in 899. And An-Nasai, who dies in 915. And those are known as the six most authoritative of the hadith compilers. And look at their dates. They're all within the late 9th to early 10th century. But then you have two other genres of these Islamic traditions. Two other genres. We have the Sirah, we have the Hadith. That's why I give them two different colors. You have then a third and fourth, and I'm going to give them the same color because the man who really introduces them is Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari is the one that introduces the tafsir, which are the commentaries on the Quran, and the tahriq, which are the histories of mankind, all the way up to the time of Muhammad himself. So the tafsir and the tahriq, the commentaries and the histories, are introduced by Al-Tabari. Look at his date, 923. That's the 10th century. Now, there's many that come after Tabari, but not before. You have Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, and many others. They all come after Al-Tabari, after the 10th century. Why is this all important? Why am I showing you this? Well, if you look at the earliest of any of the traditions, do not appear for 200 years after Muhammad. That's the problem. They don't appear for 200 years. And of course, the question I ask, and the question you should all be asking your Muslim friends, is why is it we have to wait 200 years for this? Why is it the first biography we have of this man named Muhammad is not written by the men who were around him, like we have with Jesus Christ? You have Matthew and John, who were eyewitnesses to what they were writing. They saw what Jesus did. They heard what he said in the last 3 years of his life. Luke and Mark got it from the eyewitnesses. So they were there living with Jesus, seeing, walking with Jesus. They wrote down what they saw. They wrote down what they heard. They wrote it from two eyewitness perspectives and the other two from borrowing from the eyewitness. So you have 4 different eyewitnesses, or others getting it from the eyewitnesses who wrote it from 4 different perspectives. That's why we can trust it. But we don't have any eyewitnesses here, not one eyewitness. They're not anywhere near Muhammad, nor are they even in the same century, let alone do they live anywhere where Muhammad lived. So if you want to look to Abdul Malik, I just put him up here because he is the one that we really know began what we know as Islam. We don't have anything before Abdul Malik that we can identify as Islamic, as you're going to see by the end of this lecture. So let's look at his dates. 692 is when he starts to introduce Islam. That's 141 years before the traditions finally get it right and finally get it down and finally get it on paper or on parchment or on vellum or whatever the material they were using at that time. 140 years it takes for them to get this guy down. And notice, all of these traditional writers are in the Abbasid period. I'm going to keep reminding you of that. That's so important, in the Abbasid period. And the other problem we have now is distance. So let's take a look. The Islamic traditions say everything happened in Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz. There they are in green. I'm going to keep them green because everything from that area is the green of Islam. That's what they claim, Medina and Mecca. You can see it on the map. Yet all of the writers of the traditions working in Baghdad, which is much too far north. That's where the red dot is. I'm going to keep that in red because that means there's a problem with it. Ibn Hisham is from Basra. Take a look at him there. That's his day. We know that he grew up in Cairo, however. Now, Basra is about 530 kilometers from Baghdad, and Cairo would be 1,700 kilometers from Baghdad. So he is the one that writes the Sirah. What about the Hadith? Well, the Hadith are first introduced by Al-Bukhari here. Here you can see Al-Bukhari. Now, he's way up here. Al-Bukhari is, or from Bukhara, which is up in what is today Uzbekistan. Bukhara to Baghdad is 2,400 kilometers away. So he did not come from Arabia. He did not come from Mecca, Medina. He didn't even come from Baghdad. He came from Bukhara. Al-Tabari, who is the one who writes the Tafsir and the Tahriq, he comes from Tabaristan. Tabaristan, as you can see, is way up there in the northeast. It's in what is today Iran. Now, it is 1,000 kilometers from Baghdad. Are you following this? Take a look at that map. I want you to see this because this is so important that you visually see this. The conclusion, none of the traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina, which is down south. They were too far to the north of Mecca and came from the west and east of Baghdad. So they were all up in what we now know today as the Abbasid period, or the Abbasid area. That's why it's important that I bring this up. All of these northern areas are where the Abbasids originated from. None of them are from the Hijaz. None of them agree with what the Islamic traditions are telling us. Okay, now let's go and let's see what is really my remit for today. We, or I should say I myself, am no longer interested in the 9th and 10th century. When I get this all the time, when I put up my videos and I get all these Muslims who keep trying to remind me of what these traditions say, I keep on saying, please don't waste my time. You're just wasting my time. I don't care about the 9th and 10th century traditions anymore. They are just too late and just too far away to be trusted. The traditions that you see in the 9th and 10th century were all constructed by the Abbasids, all after 749, and they definitely had an agenda. And we're going to see this as we go through. There is an enormous agenda in what they were writing and what they were maintaining and what they were imposing on everybody else. Therefore, I'm not interested in the 9th and 10th century. We are only interested in the 7th and 8th centuries. For this talk, we're going to try to keep our minds centered on the 7th and 8th century. Why? Because that's where it all began. And that's therefore where we need to be. You always, as a historian, go back to the earliest text. You always go back to the earliest place. And in this case, the earliest text and the earliest place all come from the north. not from down south, and certainly not from Mecca and Medina. All right? So there's a poem that I'm going to begin with. I'm not going to read the whole poem. You can read it there. It's by Robert Frost. I want to just center on the last stanza because it's the last stanza that we're talking about here. I should be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made all the difference. That's what we're talking about here. We are many times given a choice to either follow one road or the other. Many times we're given this idea that we listen, you must go to where everybody else goes, go where everybody else has gone. And this is what has happened with Islam. The emergence of Islam has always been that narrative, has always been from that perspective, has always been from where everybody else has gone, because that's the only one, that's the only choice they've had. Well, that's the only choice they had until this year. Now we're saying, let's go to the other road. There's another road. There's another avenue. There's a whole nother road that is not at all been used. And if you notice, the grass, as Robert Frost says, the grass is much higher here. And it's very clear that nobody has walked on this road. We're walk down that road today. And what I'm going to do in the quest, this is my quest. I'm going to go to the road less traveled, the road not taken. And that's what we're going to do for the next hour and a half. Go to that road, see what we find, and see if we can come up with conclusions. We've seen the problems with the Islamic traditions. We see that they're too far away, they're too late, and they are written with an agenda, an Abbasid agenda. The Abbasid Empire that really comes into its ascendancy in 749 and later. So let's go ahead and see what we begin with. And I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to really start with the book, go to the man, then end with the place. The book, the man, and the place. The book of the man, the book of the man, the win. That's my phrase. I love it. I've been given it. You can ask Beth. I think they have actually bought the copyright. They have copyrighted that phrase for me before I left England back in 2017. So let's start with the book. The book is so important because this is foundational for everything that Muslims believe and everything they have to follow. What do they claim about this book? Well, we talked about this in the last 2 weeks, so this is going to be review. Much of what I'm going to do in this section is mostly review. They claim that the Quran is uncreated and exists eternally on clay tablets in heaven. That's in chapter 85, verse 22. Therefore, they have to make that claim. They also claim that it was sent down to Muhammad between 610 and 632, though not written fully down until the time of 652. That we get from Al-Bukhari, volume 6, book number 61, hadith number 509. And then they was completed with one in 652. And that we also get from Al-Bukhari, volume 6, book number 61, hadith number 510, the very next hadith. They also claim that it has not changed in the last 1400 years. And the reason why is because the Quran cannot change. We get that in Surah 10, ayah 15, and Surah 18, ayah 27. So it's very clear that nobody can change the word of God. Not one word, not one letter. The reason why? Because it's guarded by Allah in chapter 15, verse 9. So not only can they not change it, there is no human intervention. It is guarded by Allah, so it cannot be changed. And that's why people like Dr. Yasser Qadi and Dr. Shabir Ali have to keep maintaining that stance that there is not one word, not one letter change. They can't go any left or right because the Quran imposes that on them. And since the Quran makes that claim, they've got to submit to its jurisdiction. The Quran was finally canonized in 1924, they would say, and made official in 1985. Now, they don't like to admit it, but there's another way they can get around it because it's historical. It's part of their narrative of the modern century. So, canonized in 1924, and we, therefore, today we really can't confront the first two categories. Why? Because uncreatedness. How do you confront that? Sent down, we're not there in the 7th century. We wouldn't be eyewitness to that event, but we can. Number 3, 4, 5, and 6. The last 4 we can confront. We are gonna confront. We have to do that. So let's begin with how the Quran was canonized, how it was finally chosen, a canon, where it was finally given that jurisdiction. So let's get into canonization, how it was created. Now this video is up. I put up on October 9th. So all of these lectures are from separate videos that have been put up in just this year. October 9th, so we're talking about this month, I put up this video on the canonization. Dr. Shadi Nasser, that's on Fander Films. Dr. Shadi Nasser has been a great friend. And if any of you are aware, have any chance to look at his book from 2012, or even if you want to put your name in for the book that's coming out this month on the 22nd, So we're talking about just another week. He's coming out with a brand new book. And he's at the 5 periods of Quranic canonization, or the 5 different periods where the Quran was created. And he categorizes them, and he doesn't do this, but I'm going to do this because to make it easier for you. The first one is the Uthmanic canon. He doesn't call it the Uthmanic canon. He calls it the canon of 652, but I'm going to call it by name of person so you can follow the people. It's easier to memorize it. So canon number 1 is the Uthmanic rendition or recitation, not recitation, sorry, recension is the word I'm looking for. The Uthmanic recension, 652. That's the first canon. The second one, he says, is the canon of 936. So this would be the Ibn Mujahid, who then chose the 7 readings. So that's the second canon, the 7 readings. The third canon he talks about is Al-Satibi. Al-Satibi was the one who then chose the 2 transmitters for every one of the 7 readings. So he chose the 14 transmitters, the 14 students, the 14th Rawiya. These are the students who come within the families, within the stables of the 7 readers. That was done in 1388. Look at the date, 1388. We're talking about 14th century. And then the 4th canon would be Al-Jazari. And Al-Jazari is probably the most famous for all the Qira'at because he is the one that adds another 3 readers and another 6 riwayat, or another 6 transmitters, along with the 3 readers. And that happens, look at the date, 1429. So we're talking about the 15th century. I mean, look at the dates. People aren't looking at the dates. And finally, we then end with the Hafs canon, which is the last canon, the 5th canon, and the final canon in 1924 that was chosen by Muhammad ibn al-Husayni al-Haddad there in Cairo. Let's just look at the first one. This is the first one that we're going to refer to, and this is the one that Shadi has already talked about. The one that he's coming out with on the 22nd is going to be the second canon, which would be the Ibn Mujahid. This first canon, Uthman's Quran. In order to know about this, in order to find out about it, you need to go to Sahih Bukhari, volume 6. I should say book 61 in there, and then hadith number 509. This is the first kana, the first recension of Abu Bakr. 632 to 634. Muhammad has died. There's a battle in Yamama. 70 of those who are in the battle get killed, and with them takes their memory. And because they had memorized the Quran, these are the reciters. Because of the fact that they had died, there was a crisis. And so Abu Bakr, along with Umar, decide to do something about it. They cannot they cannot continue this to happen, because if all those who had memorized the Quran had died, then there would be no Quran. So they bring in Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, and they ask him to write it down. They have to have a written text, because memorization is not good enough, proving that there is a crisis with memorization. Now, Zayd ibn Thabit at first balks against it. He doesn't want to do so. He says, why can I do something that the Prophet didn't even do? And they said, it's a good thing to do it. So he finally relents, and he goes and writes it down. He goes to different men who had memorized it, took what they had memorized. He goes and finds some of it on bones and stones and on bark and leaves, and he puts it together and hands it to Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr then gives it to Umar. Umar then gives it to his daughter Hafsa, who used to be one of the wives of Muhammad, and she puts it under her bed. Rather odd that she put it under her bed if this is the only copy of the Quran at that time, the first copy, the only one. And she leaves it there for about 20 years. And then we go into the second recension, and this is the recension of 652, and this is the one that's best known, and this is the one that Muslims always point to, and this is the one they always say is the recension or the Quran that we now have in our hand today. Again, another battle happens. This is another battle. So you have the Battle of Yamama in 632. Now in 652, 20 years later, you have a second battle. And this battle, you have a number of the Muslims who are there in Mecca and Medina. They're going up to Azerbaijan to fight against the Azerbaijanis, much like what's happening right now today, that Azerbaijanis are fighting against the Armenians right now. And they get up there and they meet other Muslims from Syria and from Kufa and Basra, from Iraq. So from Syria and from Iraq, these Muslims are there fighting alongside them against the Azerbaijanis. They go to the mosque and they recite the Quran. And as people like Khudaima, who is from Medina, as he listens to the Quran being recited by these Syrians and these Iraqis, he notices that their Quran is not the same. And he goes to blows with them. He fights them. He says, what are you doing? This is not the Quran. So he comes back down to Medina. He's incensed. He's angry. And he goes to the Caliph, Uthman, and he says to the Caliph, listen, we must be careful. We must not do like what the Christians have Jews done and have many, many different Qurans. We must have just one Quran, just one Quran. Therefore, let's bring it, let's create and let's write down this Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect, because that's the dialect of the Hijaz, that's the dialect of Mecca and Medina, that's the dialect of Muhammad, and supposedly, therefore, that's the dialect that is in heaven. That's the dialect that is in heaven. And that's why he demands that Uthman creates this dialect. And so Uthman agrees. And so he gets Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary, the man who had already put the first Quran together, and the one that he put together way back in 632, gave it to Abu Bakr, who gave it to Umar, who gave it to Hafsa, who put it under her bed. He says, get that one from Hafsa, get it from under her bed, bring it out here, and rewrite the Quran. Rewrite it in the Qurayshi dialect. And then he chooses 3 men. Alas, Zubair, and Hisham. 3 of them. Now, who were these men? These were his son-in-laws. These were part of his family. They were married to his daughters. They had no experience. They had no ability. They were not scholars. They were nothing more than part of the family. And he chooses those 3 men to accompany Zayd ibn Thabit to rewrite the Quran and put it in the Qurayshi dialect, so it's in that final dialect, which he does. And he, Zayd ibn Thabit, then hands Uthman this Quran. This is the Qurayshi Quran, 652. And then what does Uthman do next? He then takes all the other Qurans, that means the Qurans from Basra, from Baghdad, and they're up in Damascus and Syria. He takes all those Qurans and he burns them, destroys them, so that there's only one Quran, and this is now known as his Uthmanic Quran, the Qurayshi Quran. And then he sends these to 5 cities. Now, this all happens, this we read, I'm embellishing what you're reading right in front of you. You can tell that that's not what it all says in front of you. That's just the bare bones. But to help you understand that, let's put it on a timeline so you can see what I'm talking about. So let's go through this timeline and let's unpack it. This is known as the 7th century Qira'at. So here you begin with one Quran, all right? Here's that one Quran. That's the Quran that existed when Muhammad died. That's the Quran that was given to him. I'm assuming that that's the Qurayshi Quran because that's what he spoke. He only knew one language. He didn't travel that much. We don't know that he went up to the other Quraysh. And if he did, he was only up there a few days and came back down. So he wouldn't have learned any other dialect. However, he noticed that there were other people around him who did not understand the Qurayshi dialect. So he asked Jibril, the angel, if he could give him 6 others. So there'd be 7 different readings. So at that time, according to Islam, 7 readings were then given. 7 readings. So now there were 7 Qurans. 7 Qurans by the time he dies. The Qurayshi plus 6 others. And I'm assuming the 6 others, these are dialects, I assume. This is what Shabir Ali always says. These are dialects, 7 ways of saying the same thing, 7 different areas where Arabic is used. So that would include Basra, Baghdad, Damascus. That would also include Mecca and Medina. But remember, 7 readings by the time Muhammad dies. That's what I'm told. That's what we're all told. Then Uthman comes around and has that battle that way up there in Azerbaijan, and Hudayfa comes and gets all upset and says, we got to bring it down to one Quran. We've got to bring it down to just the Qurayshi Quran, which he does. So there's back to one Quran. All right, now we're back to one Quran, and it's called the Qurayshi Quran. And that Quran, he sends to 5 cities. He sends it to Yathrib, which is Medina today. That's the archaic name in the 7th century. Sends it to Mecca, which, as we know, he then moved to in 622. Sorry, he moved from in 622. And then he sends another one to Basra, another one to Kufa, and another one to Damascus. Now, I keep them in black for a reason. Why? Because they don't speak Qurayshi dialect up there. That's farther north. There is no Qurayshi dialect. So what does he do? Well, he sends 5 readers to each one of those cities, including the 3 in the north, and they are to then impose this Qurayshi dialect on all the others. So now there are no more Qurans except the Qurayshi Quran. There's only one Quran. From one Quran to 7 and then back to one Qurayshi Quran. Sent to 5 cities with 5 readers to make sure that nobody has any other, because all the other Qurans have been burned. That's what we're told. They've all been burned. As you're going to find out, you can burn all you want, but you're not going to get rid of everything. Muslims are finding a hard way that you can't destroy things and get them really destroyed. Because what we do know then, suddenly we're told about that there is another Quran that suddenly appears way up here in Damascus by a man named Ubay ibn Ka'b, who is one of the companions of Muhammad, who knew the Quran better than any other. And he has 116 surahs. I'm assuming he's from Damascus. He has that dialect that is from Damascus, which is different than the Qurayshi. So that's why I put it in red. And then another one appears here in this city in Kufa, which is just southwest of Baghdad. And that one is for the the Quran of Ibn Masud, and his Quran has 111 surahs. So it's not even the same size as the Quran we have today. Neither is Ubay ibn Ka'b's in Damascus. So there are two more Qurans that we're told about that exist in the 7th century that are not like the Quran that is down there in Mecca and Medina. Oh, there's still another one, and this is the one of Ibn Musa's, which appears there in Basra. So now you have Ubay ibn Ka'b's Quran there in Damascus, you have Ibn Masud's Quran there in Kufa, and you have Ibn Musa's Quran there in Basra. 3 other Qurans that exist in the 7th century that are different, and as we're finding, Arthur Jeffrey, who did work just looking at the traditions about these other Qurans, he found that there were about 15,000 differences between their Quran and the Qurayshi Quran, the one that was then canonized by Uthman there in 652. Oh, hold on a minute. I forget about Zayd ibn Thabit. Yeah, we also have Zayd ibn Thabit's Quran. Oh, no, it's not red. It is green. It is Qurayshi. It is the standard. It is the standard Qurayshi Quran. So there you have the Qurayshi Quran in the south, and the other 3 are all in the north. Are you noticing that? They're all in the north. And they are not the same Qurans as the one that supposedly is the canonical Quran that we use today in the south. Visually, do you see what I'm doing here? I'm doing this specifically so you can see these other Qurans that disagree. They are not the same number of surahs. Obviously, they are not the same manuscripts as Zayd ibn Thabit's, and they are all from the north. The north is where the corrupted Qurans are from, according to the traditions. According to the traditions. So now we go into the 8th century and we get canon number 2. Well, not just 8th century, we need to move this into the 10th century because we go to Ibn Mujahid's canonization, but he is not from the 8th century. What are we talking about? Let's go and let's talk about the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, because now we get into the material that's been explosive, that's all happening all over the world right now, and has really come to the fore since June 8th, about 4 months ago. Muhammad dies in 632. Uthman's Qurayshi Quran is created in 652. We just saw that for canon number 1. Then suddenly a Quran appears in 736, and that's Ibn Amir's, Damascus. Here it is right here. I've got it. This is that Quran, folks. You seeing it? Ibn Amir, 736. So we have it in our hands today. This is over 1,000 years old. Not this book. This has been printed rather recently. I just got it off the internet, and you can get it as well. And here it is, Ibn Amir, 736. He comes with a completely different Quran that is known as his, and remember, his is from Damascus, so he is from the corrupted area. He is from way up in Damascus, not from Mecca, not from Medina. After him comes another Quran, this one, Ibn Kathir's Quran, Al-Makki. And Ibn Kathir is from Makki, which would be Mecca. He is from Mecca. So here is a Qurayshi Quran. If it is Qurayshi, it would be here. That's not till 738. Then another appears in 745 by Asim ibn Abi al-Najud. And then one other appears in 770, Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. And then you have another one, Hamza al-Zayyad from 772. And you have the Nafi from Medina in 785. One more, Al-Qasai from Kufa, who died in 805. Those are the 7. Those are the amazing 7. Now, they are chosen by this man here, but he doesn't choose them until 936. That's the 10th century. So these 7 that all the Muslims talk about are chosen by this man in the 10th century. Whenever you hear Muslims talk about the readings that Muhammad heard, or whenever, and this is another one of this Islamic dance that you're going to hear all the time. Whenever they talk about these 7 holy readings, these 7 qira'at, these 7 ahruf, they like to call them ahruf. Yasir Qadi, he calls them ahruf. When you hear about them using the ahruf, and you say, okay, what are these ahruf? They'll start naming Nafi, Ibn Kathir, Abu Amir, Ibn Amir, Asim, Hamza, and Al-Qasai. Why do they do that? Because that's all they know. They only know about these 7. What they're not told is that these 7 don't even begin to appear until the 8th century. Look at the dates. The earliest is Ibn Amir, this guy here, and he's 736. Remember, Muhammad died in 632. This is the Islamic dance that you're hearing all the time, and you have to shut them down and stop in their tracks and say, no, 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 those cannot be the 7, because they're 100 years after Muhammad. They never existed. They're not even the same century as Muhammad. Look at Abdul Malik. The first of these Qurans, these Qira'at that appears, is 44 years after Abdul Malik. So this is long after Abdul Malik. And when you look at Uthman, that's 84 years after Uthman and 100 years after Muhammad. And this is what Muslims are not doing. They're not looking at a timeline. That's why I'm putting this timeline here. You need to look at the timeline. You need to see how much of a lie this is. This is a lie that the Muslims are throwing at us. And that's why you need to shut it down whenever you get in discussion. Just show them this picture right here. Take it, use it, and certainly for those Muslims you're working at. Now, let's go on to the third canon, because we then have the riwayats that do come into play. There's the timeline that I just showed you. You can see when Muhammad died, when the Uthman's Qurayshi Quran, and then the seven readers. But then in 1388, so we're talking about the 4th century, a guy named Al-Shtibi comes along, because there are so many different Qurans that start to appear once these 7 are chosen. Well, even before that, we know, according to Shadi Nasr, there were about as many as 700 different, as possibly, we can't know for sure because we only have the names, but as possibly as many as 700 different Qurans appeared by the end of the 10th century. So that by the 14th century, by 1388, this guy Al-Shatibi had to do something about it. And so he was given the responsibility to add these. What he did is he took every one of these 7 readers and he gave just 2 riwayat, or 2 transmitters for every one of the 7 readers. That was done in the 14th century. In the 14th century, then, is when we get then the 21 designated Qurans. 7 readers plus 14 of their students, or 14 of their stable remain. The guy Hafs, the one that we're using today, is one of those. He is one of those riwayat. He is not one of the 7 readers. Notice that. He is not one of the major readers. He is nothing more than a transmitter. And he dies in 796, the late 8th century. But that's 144 years after Uthman, and that's a good 164 years after Muhammad. Look at the dates. This is what Muslims are not realizing. Hafs had nothing to do with Muhammad. He was nowhere near Muhammad. He didn't even live in the same place as Muhammad. He came from Kufa in Iraq. That is the corrupted area. So he's too far away, and he's too far distant. Too far distant in time. Now, canon number 4. Al-Jaziri's 3 plus 6. Folks, we don't just have these 21. These are not the only Qurans we have, because then in the 15th century, Al-Jaziri comes around in 1429, and he adds another 9 to this. Abu Jafar, and then 2 of his readers, Yaqub al-Yamani, and 2 of his reciters, and then you have Khalaf, and 2 of his transmitters. So by the 15th century, by 1429, we now have the 30 official Qurans that are used today. And these are the 30 that you can find. These are the 30 that Hatun has been able to find. Actually, she's found 37. These are the 30 that our good friend Muhammad Hijab had a difficulty with. When we held up just 26 of these 30, at that time in 2016, 4 years ago, Hatun had only collected 26 of them, almost all of them, and we just held up those 26. Look at the furore, and look at the destruction, and look and see what that has done around the Muslim world, and look what has happened to people like Yasser Qadi and Muhammad Hijab since June, because of these 30. This is the 30 they don't know what to do with. They don't know what to do with. Why? Well, because it was chosen by Al-Jazari. These 30 then, where these final 30 were all chosen then and finalized by Al-Jazari in 1429. That's almost 800 years too late. 800 years. Why aren't people talking about this? Well, Shadi Nasr is. We're doing it. We're getting it out to the internet. You're going to do it. Now that you know it, you've got to get this out so they can see that. And then we get to canon number 5, the last canon. And this is the one now, there you see, there's the other 4 that I see before, that I show you. You have Uthman, and then you have Ibn Mujahid, you have Al-Shatibi, you have Al-Jazari, and now we get Hafs, the final canon. Following the 30, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Husaini al-Haddad reduced it to just 1, the Qira'at Quran, in 1924. 1924. So that's almost 1,300 years too late, folks, to finally get this one Quran. It used to be 30, and then they took 29 of them. This is what Muhammad ibn Ali al-Husaini al-Haddad did. He took the 29 that disagreed with Hafs, now that he had chosen Hafs, and he threw them into the Nile, thinking that that would get rid of them. Folks, you can't throw them into the Nile. You can't burn them. They're still going to come back to nip you, as we're finding. I've got 9 of them right here. I've got 9 of them right here. And I just ordered these off the internet in August, just 2 months ago. You can do the same. Hatun has been able to come up with 37 of these Qurans. So now we're back to one official Quran. This is the last canonization in 1924, though it was not chosen worldwide until 1985. Now let's look at the orientation. Let's go back to the 9th century. Remember, Al-Bukhari, 510, 510, the Uthmanic recension. Hudayfa comes back from Azerbaijan upset because he has heard different Qurans recited from Syria and Iraq. He insists that Uthman write one Qureshi Quran and send it to every province, Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Damascus, so that there would be no other Quran, just this Qureshi Quran. Uthman then burned all the other Qurans from Basra, Kufa, and Damascus to retain the Qureshi Quran, thinking that would do away with the problem. Now there was only one Quran with one dialect. All the others have been destroyed. So where was the corrupted Qurans from? Let's remind ourselves. Remember, 5 copies were sent to 5 cities. 3 other copies then suddenly appear that are in the 7th century that are not from the Mecca and Medina. The corrupted Qurans were from Basra, Kufa, and Damascus. That's from Iraq and Syria, where you see the red arrows. That's where they all come from. So the corrupted Qurans come from that area in the north, in the countries of Syria and Iraq, and the cities of Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. Now, let's look at this northern hegemony. Let's look and see where the Qurans, these are the official. Now look here, we're looking at the official 10 ones. These are the creme de la creme, the best of the best according to Yasser Qadi. These are the 10 that the Muslims always claim. Notice how many of these 10 are Qurayshi, are from Mecca and Medina, are from the south. Well, really, we only have Nafi, we only have Ibn Kathir, and we only have Abu Jafar. So of the official 10 readers, only 3 of the 10 readers are Qurayshi. The other 7 are from the north, from Syria and Iraq. What about the 20 official transmitters? Remember, these are the ones that were chosen by Shatibi and then Al-Jazari later on. How many of them are from the south, from Mecca, Medina, are using the Qurayshi dialect? Well, Qalun, Bazi, Kunbul, Isa ibn Wardan, Ibn Jamaz. Only 5 out of the 20. Only 5 of the transmitters are using the Qurayshi dialect, are from the south, are from Mecca, Medina, from the Hijaz. Thus, of the 30 official qira'ats, only 8 use the Qurayshi dialect, and Hafs was not one of them. In fact, his dialect from Kufa was one which Uthman burned, because his was from the corrupted dialect. All right? So let's look at this northern dominance. Put it on a map so you can see what I'm talking about. Mecca had 3 qira'ats. Medina had 5 qira'ats. They're in green. Cairo had 1 qira'at, that's Warsh. Damascus had 3 qira'ats. Basra had 6 qira'ats. Kufa had 12 qira'ats. Out of the 30 official qira'ats, 8 are from the Hijaz, 22 are from the north, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. 22 of the 30 official qira'ats are not from the Hijaz, where the traditions say the Quran was created, where the traditions tell us that Islam began, where the traditions tell us that Muhammad received this Qurayshi dialect Quran that from Jibril during the periods of 610 to 632. All 22, the vast majority of them are not from that area at all, completely confronting the Islamic traditions. Today's Hafs, the official one, the one that we use today, the Hafs Quran, is from Kufa, again, up in the north. The conclusion? A minority of the Qurans originated in Mecca or Medina, while the majority were too far to the north. Note, all of these northern areas, except for Cairo, are where the Abbasids originated from. This is all the Abbasid area. Hugely important, as you're going to see as we move on. Now, conclusions concerning these canons? Well, Shadi Nasr's 5 stages of canonization are a good model to use when ascertaining the Quranic canon. Canon 1, Uthman's 652 canon, is located too far south, and the real manuscripts were all further north. Canon number 2, Ibn Mujahid's 936 IED canon of 7 is made up of 2 in the Hijaz and 5 up north. Canon number 3, Al-Shatibi's canon of 14, that's the transmitters, is made up of 3 in the Hijaz and 11 up north. And then canon number 4, Al-Jaziri's canon of 9, is made up of 3 in the Hijaz and 6 in the north. Final canon number 5, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Husayni al-Haddad's canon of 1, is singularly up north. Thus, of the 30 official Qurans in use today, only 8 are from the Hijaz and 22 are from the north. These areas are up north, were all in the areas of the Abbasids, where they resided, where they ruled, and where they created. Are we beginning to see a pattern here? I hope you're seeing what I'm doing here. It's intentionally, I'm doing this for a reason. Now let's go to the Razm. Let's go to the skeletal text. This video is uploaded in October 13th, just 2 days ago. So it's very recent. You can go up and see it on Fander Films. I'm not going to go into this very much because it's already done did good 2 hours of it in the video I just put up 2 days ago. But we do have 6 major manuscripts that I did look at last week. You all know what I talked about them. I talked and I introduced the Topkapi, and I noticed and I showed you that last week, even last week, 2 days before I did that video, 2 days before I did the teaching with you, 2 days before we all came together last week, I got some brand new information by one of the leading scholars on this manuscript. I can't give you his name because he has not published yet. Once he publishes, we can go to it. He did say that it is one of the most comprehensive of all the manuscripts, but he did not give a date to the 7th century, nor did he agree with Al-Takulich and Ahmed and Isanlu. He says, no, they are incorrect. It is not the early 8th century. He gives the date from 747, that is mid, look at the mid 8th century. That is about the time the Abbasids come into power, up until 819. So he puts it up from the mid 8th century up into the 9th century. It's a much, much later text. What's more, of the 2,270 variants that Al-Takulich and Isanlu talk about, he says that is not all. There are many others that he has not come across that they weren't aware of. And the reason why, they just did a cursory look at it. They weren't looking at it very effectively, nor were they looking at it very discreetly. And that's why this is all going to blow much of this out once we get this published. The Samarkand manuscript is a fascinating one because this is the one goes up to Surah 43. It's only about 50% of the Quran. It is absolutely hopeless as a Quran because it uses unsophisticated Arabic. It is written by about 5 different scholars. It is dated to the mid 8th century. It is a monumental text. That's why you can see that it's much larger than others. And what's more, it has all kinds of grammatical mistakes. It has errors after error after error. There's only, of the 43 surahs that are there's only 1 surah that is complete. 16 of them don't even exist within those 43 surahs. So it is missing wholesale pieces. It is very, very much what we call an inept manuscript, a manuscript that's put together by inept people and maintained by even more inept people. We came across the Ma'il Musaf, which is there in London, that we've been using. That's my picture of it there in the British Library. It is possibly from either the early 8th century or Martin Links puts it to the late 8th century. That one is still up, and we're still trying to figure out the date for that. But it only goes up to Surah 43, much like the Samarkand. And it is full of manuscript variants. When we looked at the Husayni Cairo, we noticed that this one not only is late, mid 8th century, now they're putting it possibly back as far as the 9th century. It's another monumental text, much like the Samarkand, but it is riddled with what we call coverings. You can see a few of them there on the right. These are coverings that have been put over to censor the text. And there are hundreds of these coverings. I showed you one example from Dr. Brubaker's book, which comes up with just 1 page, 8 coverings on 1 page. You almost can't finish reading the page. It's so riddled with coverings to standardize it, bringing it back to the 1924 Hafs text. The Patricino Petropolitanus early manuscript, has a very much of a rudimentary script. It also, there are 3 different main manuscripts from the Petropolitanus collection, and the biggest one is only about 29% of the Quran, so it's only a third of the Quran. It has about 93 variants that we know of that François de Roche speaks of. He's the one that's done the most work on this. And it looks like the Birmingham folios, the 2 folios that were found in Birmingham and dated from 568 to 645 using dating, that that Birmingham folio is from this manuscript. And this manuscript is from the 8th century. It is not from the 7th century. I'll show you why once we get to the carbon dating problems. The Sanaa manuscript, the one that is my favorite, this is the one that we now have found some brand new material. The world scholar on becoming the world scholar on this manuscript was on the phone with me last week before I went and introduced this manuscript, showing it that there much of what we now know about the Sanaa manuscript, especially of the two palimpsests. The palimpsest, the writing that's below and above the line, this palimpsest, the lower layer is not just verses. It's actually about 11% of the Quran that he has now found in that lower layer, much more. And Asma Halili did not do a good job on her book. The book that she came out with just 3 years ago, this one here. This, we're going to have to throw this book away because much of what he is finding is confronting what she has put up. And he is very clear that this is not, that lower layer is a nascent Quran, which then got standardized and changed and manipulated and accreted and deleted in the upper layer about 705 or later. So it is early. It's probably the earliest of all the manuscripts. That's the upper layer. The lower layer is even earlier. In fact, he is saying the lower layer is probably the Ibn Masud's codex that we're looking for. It looks like it may be the one that we're looking for, Ibn Masud, and it is not at all like the Quran that we have today. So hold on, hold the space. The Birmingham folio, I did mention that I was going to go into that, dated from 568 to 645. This Birmingham folio, which is fascinating because it includes surahs 18, 19, and 20. Fascinating. People thought that this is the oldest Quran, and they say, look, it follows the time that Muhammad lived. He lived from 570 to 632, but take a look. It predates Muhammad's life by 2 years of his birth, and it postdates his life by a good 12 years. But what's most interesting, if you take 645 as the latest date, the best date, that is 7 years before Uthman's Quran. So you cannot have a Quran that early because those were all destroyed. Those were all burnt, unless, of course, this is one of those that got away. What's interesting, it's only 33 verses. And the chapter 18, 19, 20 have 343 verses. So this is only 33 out of 343. What happened to the other 300 verses? When you look at the Quran in its entirety, that's 6,236 verses. This is only 33 out of 6,200. Folks, this is a very small portion of the Quran. This is not a full manuscript like Muslims are claiming. What's more, take a look at the stories that are included in chapter 18, 19, and 20. Chapter 18 is the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. In chapter 18, 19 to 98, it comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. That's 100. That is dated to 145 AD. The pseudo-gospel of Matthew is also part of that. It's from 600 AD. And then the rest of the story in chapter 20, verse 1 to 40, is the story of Moses, which would have come from the Bible itself. All of these 3 stories predate the Quran. They would have all been there long before the Quran was put together because they were all from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th up until the 6th century. So this is not surprising if these are earlier, if the dates are right. But here's the problem. And this is what Dr. Mark Dury comes out with. When you look at carbon dating, you need to look at the bell curve. And it's the median part of that bell curve that is the most authoritative for those dates. What's more, if you look at the bell curve for these dates, it would the strongest date for this manuscript would be 610. 610 is when Muhammad started receiving his revelation. So these folios, these 2 pages, front and back, each side, are only reading from when Muhammad just began his revelation. We could go with that if you want to, but you need to look at carbon dating. When you look at carbon dating, you need to look at this. These are carbon dates that have been done to the Sanaa manuscript. The Sanaa manuscript was taken to laboratories. And it was first taken, but before we do that, let's just look at the Birmingham folio here. The Birmingham folio's dates there. Can you see it? I just circled it in green. So 568 to 645. There is the Birmingham folio on that graph. That's the one that Muslims are claiming is the oldest Quran. Well, 2 folios. There is Muhammad's life. Now, I've only got circled really where he received the Qurans from 610 to 632. His life starts at 570, so further down. And there is the Uthmanic Ascension, 562, circled in brown. So those are the dates that are, well, we don't dispute Muhammad's life, though we could, and we don't dispute Uthmanic Ascension. Let's go with those dates. However, the Sanaa manuscript were taken into the laboratory in Lyon to do carbon dating, and this is what they came up with. 388 to 535, 433 to 599, 543 to 643, 543 to 643, and 603 to 662. Now look at the discrepancy that they found with just one laboratory. They said, this is not right. Why are we finding so much discrepancy? So they decided especially to go to the one on the left, because the one on the left was especially curious because it is so early. It's dated 388 to 533, 388 to 533. That's even before Muhammad lived. That's certainly long before Islam and long before the Quran came into existence. So they went back to that one, that fragment, and they sent it to 3 other labs there in Europe. They sent it to the laboratory in Kiel in Germany, and that's the date it came up with, looking at the same fragment using carbon dating, and that was dated from 410 to 460. Even the latest date is over 100 years before Muhammad was born. They sent it to Zurich in Switzerland, and they dated that same fragment from 480 to 546. And then they sent it the same fragment to the Oxford laboratory that had dated the Birmingham folio earlier, and it dated it from 504 to 550. Ooh, take a look at that. What does that tell you? Well, I'll tell you what it tells me. When you look at those 4 from 4 different laboratories, all in Europe, Lyon, Kiel, Zurich, and Oxford, all the 4 Sana A findings, they're on the left that I just circled, all done in the 4 European laboratories, are between 388 and 550. 388 and 550. Note, Muhammad's life, 570 to 632. That means these are 80 to 240 years too early. These are 80 to 240 years too late. If you look at Uthman's recension, which I've circled there in 652, they're 100 to 260 years too late. There's the problem. And the difficulty is, are we going to trust carbon datings? Because they're so discrepant. If you're looking at one fragment from 4 different laboratories, the Lyon laboratory looks like it's got a problem because it dates just that same fragment from many different dates. When you look at the one fragment and date it to 4 different laboratories, you get that discrepancy. But what you do get is that they're all earlier than Muhammad, they're earlier than the Quran, and they're earlier than Islam. Now, so you can see there's a real problem with carbon dating. Be careful of carbon dating. Let's go to the Razms, because we're going to go to the skeletal text. What do I mean? This is the skeletal text. Take a look at you have the Samarkand on the left, you have the Sana on the right. And you notice that there are no dots. There should be 5 dots and 3 vowels. There are no 5 dots, and there's no Dhamma, Kasra, or Fatha on any of those pages. Why? Because these are the skeletal text. In the 7th century, when the Quran supposedly was first written down, according to what the traditions tell us, the Arabic at that time was so crude that it only had 16 letters. And that's the problem. Those are the 16 letters that you see on these manuscripts. Much too crude to understand what you're looking at. So Dan has come out and he's looked and he did his work. And Dan Brubaker, this book that you see right here, this is the book. If you don't have it, get it. Make sure you get this in your library. This is the first one and the only one so far that's been out that's done any research on this skeletal text, the Razm. And what he looked at, he noticed that in the last, we're talking about 8 years, he's now found 4,000 changes to the skeletal text. This has nothing to do with the dots. This has nothing to do with the vowels. This has everything to do with the skeletal text, the Razm, the consonantal letters. And he's found 4,000 of these changes. What kind of changes are we talking about? Well, you can see he's found insertions. I'm not going to go through this. They're all on the video I did last week. They're up on Fanderfilm. You can go watch them. He's found hundreds of insertions, words that have been added at a later date. You could say those are scribal errors, possibly, yes, but you'll see some of them have dots and vowels. They have diacritical marks, which means they could not be there, and they're also squashed in between other words. And you can see they're added at a later date, and they're added when there were dots and vowels now in use, which mean post-8th century. So that's very clear that those cannot be scribal mistakes. Those are intentional additions, intentional insertions done by men like me and you. And now there are also erasures, quite hundreds of erasures. And the erasures are much more problematic for Muslims because if you're erasing something, then there was something there that you're erasing. There's something there you're leaving blank. There was something there that you no longer can see. And the fact that it was there shows that that was a different text. That was a different story. That was a different verse. What has been left behind now that we erased now supports the Hafs text. In almost every case, what Dan found is they all support the Hafs text. More damaging are the coverings and the tapings, because the coverings and the tapings are intentional coverings where they're putting over not just words, sometimes entire lines, sometimes entire sections, like the tapings where you have squares that have nothing to do with patching a damaged area, because what's left now supports the Huff's text. They're actually censoring the text. You cannot say that's scribal errors. That's intentional changes at a later date to bring a standardization to the text so that they all are saying the same thing. And what are they saying? Go to the Huff's text and you'll find out. Here then we come to a brand new area, and this is the Quranic Arabic. Is it from the Hijaz or is it from north? Where does it come from? Well, the traditions tell us that all of the Quran is derived from the Qurayshi dialect, which is from the Hijaz. This we get from Al-Bukhari, volume 6, book 61, hadith number 510. There you see that is in the rectangle, the green rectangle. This is the dialect used by Muhammad. This is also the dialect employed by Uthman and sent to the 5 cities. Now, is it from the Levant? Well, note what we are finding. Dr. Mark Dury says the evidence points away from Mecca to the southern Levant, in other words, Jordan, up there where now you have the red rectangle. For this is a dialect in which the consonantal skeleton or razm of the Quran was recorded. In each case, the razm accords with what we know of the southern Levantine Arabs. There are 4 areas, he goes on, in Quranic Arabic, all word final unstressed inflectional vowels, which have been influenced by the southern Levant Arabic, suggesting that the Quran was derived from there, from way up north. What are these 4 things? When you look at the Quran, when you look at the Arabic that's in the Quran, it has these, what we call word final unstressed inflectional vowel. It's hard to say, it's such a long word, but these are the ending of the words, and these vowels endings are not found in the Arabic that comes from Mecca and Medina. They are all found in the Arabic that comes from much further north. Let's look through them. The first one is what they call the irab, short final vowels. In the Quranic script, unstressed inflectional short final vowels are marked with diacritics. They are not represented in the razm. These endings are known as irab because they were characteristics of the Bedouin of the Arab dialects much further north. Although classical pre-Quranic Arabic poetry incorporated i'rab endings in its rhyme schemes, the Quran does not. The irrelevance of case endings to Quranic rhyme schemes suggests that they had been lost. Where was this dialect native location? The southern Levant is a possible location, Mark Dury says. When you go to the Ta Marbuta, this is another one that he talks about. In the Nabatean Arabic, the feminine ending at had changed to a. This seems to have been a regional feature in the southern Levant. Ancient northern Arabic desert inscriptions do not show this change. This is restored in the non-pausal pushes to the at, and you can see it with the ati that you see, the Ta Marbuta that they have in current Arabic. Standard recitation of the Quran by the addition of this 2 superimposed dots to give. There you can see it. I should have made it a little bit larger. There's the Ta Marbuta that's always put at the end, indicating that the letter ha is to be pronounced as ta or at when you do it orally. In this respect, the dialect in which the Quran was composed appears to have taken what was a feature of southern Levant Arabic, where the sound change was first initiated, and established it in Nabatean Arabic. And then we have the Aleph Maksura. The Aleph Maksura is the use in classical Arabic of the final dotless ya. There you can see how it's written there in the graph. It is another form of the final aleph and is used because an aleph cannot occur at the end of a word. It always has to come at the beginning. The aleph, or no, you have an aleph also in the middle of a word, but not at the end. That's why they have to put the S shape. The Aleph Maksura was not pronounced as when the Quran was originally being recited. Al-Jalad, in his seminal work back in 2017, proposes that the Aleph Maksura goes back to an earlier saying ai, and is reflected in the Greco-Arabica of the southern Levant. Here again, Dury says, the evidence shows that the pronunciation of the Quranic Arabic at the time of its initial composition aligns with the Arabic of the southern Levant, much further north. And then finally, the definite article. Now we have the undefinite article, the. One final piece of evidence concerns the assimilation of the definite article, al, in the following consonant, coronal consonants. The lack of assimilation in the Rosm agrees with the evidence of Greco-Arabic, Nabatean, Safavidic, and Ismailic scripts. Where do all these scripts come from? The Arabic of the Quran was not a Meccan dialect. None of these Greco-Arabic, Nabatean, Safavidic, and Ismailic are from the south, but instead conform to the features of the southern Levantine dialects. They are all further north, over 600 miles further north. In every one of these four similarities, they are all derived from the southern Levant, which is over 600 miles too far north to be native to the Hijaz area. Look at the map above. This completely confronts the traditional Islamic accounts, which claims the Quran is uniquely from the Hijaz. I'm going to say something a little later about the Arabic that is from that area. Wait till you do that. That's later on in this talk. What about the Hafs text itself? The Hafs text, the one that is used today, the one that has become the official canonical text. Now, let's go back to the Kirat conundrum that we talked about earlier. And let's remember the 10 readers and the 20 transmitters. There they are. We've already gone through this. You know what I'm talking about. These are the 10 readers and the 20 transmitters. With the 30 to choose from, they chose the Hafs in 1924. But was he a good choice? No, he wasn't. Here's why. How many of the 10 readers use the Qurayshi dialect? We just went through this. You've seen before. 3 of them from the 10 readers. And of the 20 transmitters, we have 5 of the 20, which makes out of the 30, 8. 8 of them use the Qurayshi dialect. Hafs was not one of those 8. In fact, his dialect from Kufa was one which Uthman burnt, was considered to be a corrupted text. If that is the case, let's then look and see where he is from. Kufa in Iraq. Let's remind ourselves where Kufa is exactly. There it is. It's just just southwest of what is today Baghdad. It was the center of learning during the Abbasid period. That's why it's important. This is why it's such an important place. Note how far north Kufa is from the Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are situated. The Islamic traditions stipulate that Muhammad's Quran and that of Uthman were written in the Qurayshi dialect, which is the dialect of the Hijaz, there within the green rectangle. Yet the final canonized Quran is not from there at all, but from much further north. To conclude, I have 5 problems with Hafs. First of all, he wasn't trustworthy, therefore not suitable. Many of those who then talked about Hafs said that he lied, that he used bad qira'ats, that he did not use the proper injunction, that he tried to impose stuff on his Quran that were not liable, or that were liable. He wasn't chosen for textual veracity or authenticity, but for political reasons. What political reasons? Well, he was chosen by Muhammad ibn al-Huzayni al-Haddad because the Ottomans chose the Hafs. Why did the Ottomans choose the Hafs? Because it was the simplest to read. And it also comes from Kufa, which is closest to them. And that's why they chose it. So this is for political reasons, nothing to do with textual veracity. Plus, on top of that, he came from the wrong city. He did not come from Mecca, Medina. He came from Kufa. And he came with the wrong dialect. He should have come with the Qurayshi dialect. But it's obvious if he's come from Kufa, he did not speak or use the Qurayshi dialect. He should have been the last person amongst the 30 to have been chosen. We're moving now into the third area. We've gone through the problem with the sources. We've moved into, did a brief overview of the problems with the book. Now we're going to the man, a critique of Muhammad historically. And almost everything you're going to hear from here on out will be new for you, because it's new for me. This is all stuff that we've kind of come into, we've kind of fallen into. It's by accident. It's been exciting. I've been using people like Mel from Sneakers Corner. I've been using people like Murad from the Middle East. I can't tell you what country he's from. And I've been using others like Joe and some others whose names I'm not permitted to use. Just because this is the difficulty. This is one of the ironies about this whole work. The material that we're actually investigating can kill us. It can actually put us in jeopardy and put us in harm's way. This is what Hattun's facing at the moment. And because of the fact that it is unique, I don't know of any other area in the world, any other area of study where what you find, what you research, what you publish, what you put up on video will actually put your life in danger. I don't know of any other area that is the case except Islam, and except when it comes to historical critique of Islam. The historical critique is doing so much damage to Islam at the moment. and that it's causing an enormous backlash. And we're all getting it. We are getting this backlash. So those who I have to work with, who I enjoy working with, I don't have to, I choose to. Those ones who are part of the team that is doing the research, many of them are in very insecure areas. They know languages that I don't know. They are able to get to material that we can't access, and they're coming up and they're sharing that with us. These are not, most of them are not Christians. They're not people who come from the same tradition I come from, or from those of us who I'm speaking to come from. Yet they do want to see Islam scrutinized, and they are able to go back to the original documents of many of these different languages, much like what Dr. Patricia Crone did with her 15 languages, or Dr. Robert Hoyland with his 18 languages, archaic languages. Some of these are even dead languages, and they're going back to, and they're pulling out what they now find from the 7th and 8th century. And that's my area of interest, 7th and 8th century, like I said at the very beginning, and including the man Muhammad. We're going to look back and see what we now know about this man Muhammad from the 7th and 8th century. What the Muslims claim concerning him is that Muhammad has been the last and was the greatest of all prophets, and the last of all the chain of prophets. They would say he would be on the whole line of prophets, starting with Adam and Eve all the way up to him. The Quran was his revelation, sent down only to him, and is the final and greatest revelation. So therefore it supersedes all previous revelations, but including the Old and New Testament. Islam, therefore, they would conclude, is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings. That's known as the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teachings. So those are the two different pillars, the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Quran itself. Therefore, Islam is completely dependent on one book and one man, the book and the man. So we have already investigated the Quran historically. Now it's time to do the same with Muhammad. Let's go and look at the letters, because Muslims have come up, and I've gotten a lot of these letters that have been sent to me to say, what about this letter? What about this letter? Because supposedly Muhammad sent out anywhere from 11 to 20 different letters to people for alliance, for protection, things like this. And these letters are now being used to prove that Muhammad existed in the 7th century. And probably I'm not going to go through all of them. If you want to look at the video on this, you can go up to the video that I uploaded on April 22nd. And the one that I'm going to look at more specifically, probably is the most famous, is the Astiname letter. This is the letter that supposedly Muhammad sent to these monks in St. Catherine's Monastery there in Sinai, and there is a picture of it on the right. What is this letter? Well, it was written by Muhammad, or by Zayd ibn Thabit, obviously, since Muhammad couldn't read and write, his secretary, to the monks in St. Catherine's Monastery, promising them protection and other privileges. Now, what many Muslims say, that it was written by Ali, not really Zayd ibn Thabit, but obviously that's the Shiites who come out with that, and given to these monks, sealed with an imprint representing Muhammad's hands. The one in black, the one in gold is added at a later date. Ahmed al-Wakil's work on this in 2017 says that the copy of the covenant with the monk of Mount Sinai also claims to be an exact replica, Naql al-Asl, and an unadulterated copy, Naqlan Mustadaqan, of the original covenant, which was handed over to Sultan Sulim I, 1487 to 1510. Look at the date. Look at the date. It's a 16th century. So this is actually what we're looking at there on the right is actually from the 16th century. Muslims don't like to admit that. And that's why Ahmed al-Wakil, is important that he finally came out as a Muslim and admitted that date. What does it say? What is in it? Well, I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is basically what it comes to. The Christians can gather anywhere, and Muslims will protect their buildings. No one can plunder Christians or destroy their churches or take anything from within. A Christian woman must give her consent before she marries a Muslim man. Christian women married to Muslim men are free to go to their churches. Christians can build and repair churches and convents, and Christians cannot participate in the military. Now, when you look at that, you say, hold on a minute, this doesn't sound right, because this goes against almost everything we read about in the Quran. But that's why they're putting it forward. And that's why a lot of Muslims today like the Astiname, because it is so benevolent, it is so benign, it is so politically correct. It is exactly what they would like Islam to look like. And that's why it is now being foisted all over the Muslim world as the edict of Muhammad himself, and therefore the paradigm for Islam and for the rest of the world. But there are problems. I have 10 of them. Let me go through them. The document given is 625. That's the date.
that they give for the document. According to their traditions, Muhammad sent no letters until 628, and these were only to Medina, certainly not outside the Hijaz. So this letter, if it was sent, confronts the Islamic traditions from the 9th century. Ibn Sa'd in 845, which is the 9th century, gives a list of Muhammad's 47 writings, but the Ashnami is not included in that list. There is a minaret. If you look back, let me just go back. If you take a look, you can see there is a minaret. Can you see it on the right side there? Pictured on the right. So there is a minaret on the right. The first known minarets appear in the early 9th century during the Abbasid Caliphate and were not widely used until the 11th century. So the fact that it comes with a minaret on it suggests that it's dated much, much later and not from the 7th century, at least from the 11th century or later. It uses the term sultan. The first to ever use this term was Mahmudov Ghasna. Look at his dates. He goes from the 10th to the 11th century, 350 years too late. It also employs Christian, Egyptian, and medieval Arabic, which were not used by any Arabs in the Hijaz that early. So you can see, looking at the dates, it looks like it's a much later document. It refers to plundering and repairing churches, forced marriages, and non-participation in the military, which are all later dhimmi rules introduced centuries later. These were not introduced in the 7th century. It forbids Muslims from taking building material from churches to use in their mosques. There were no mosques in Egypt in 625. They only came to Egypt in 641, 16 years later. So already you can see a problem with the 625 date. It permitted the Christians to decide the rate of their jizya, but there is no example anywhere of this. That you cannot find any example of this in the tradition. In fact, it confronts the Islamic traditions on this point. And the term Malak Muqara, angel of proximity, is only cited in Sufi writings, first by Mutanabi in 965. That's the 10th century. So from the 10th to 13th century, or 300 to 500 years too late. The covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Jews was known first to Waqidi in 823. That's 9th to 15th century, so 200 to 800 years too late. Now, what do the scholars say about this? Bernhard Moritz, probably the one who's done the classical work. He did this in the last century, 1918. He has probably done the most study on this document. And he concludes the impossibility of finding this document to be authentic is clearly apparent. Date, style, and contents each independently provide its inauthenticity. Dr. Pat Anderson says that the dating is too late and the originals not produced in an age of papyrus are lost. The criteria for authenticity that Morrow suggests, Morrow is the Muslim scholar who has done the work trying to push it back to the 625, suggests does not meet the standard of valid historical criticism. In fact, I don't have time. If you look at the video that I did on this, he did so many errors. He was very inept, and you can see his bias is so clear all the way through his documentation. Dr. Mark Dury says this letter appears to address characteristic abuses of dhimmis in terms which only make sense after the dhimmi regulations were established, so long after Muhammad's time. Why is he talking about dhimmitude? Because he's written the book on dhimmitude, and that's why you need to look at his book on dhimmitude. He ends by saying, I suspect that it is later, namely during the period of the Turkish invasion of Egypt in the early 16th century. That's why it comes, and the earliest copy we have is from Mehmet I from the 16th century. Amidu Ulalakan Sani, referring to the covenants, he says, we find no evidence of pre-16th century codices. So he also puts this to the 16th century. And then Gabriel Said Reynolds out of Notre Dame University says this, forged by Christians intent on proving to their Muslim overlords that the prophet himself had guaranteed their well-being and the preservation of their property. They are all quite late. They date to the 16th century, over 800 years after the death of Muhammad. Why the 16th century? Why under Mehmet I? Because that is when the Christians were under persecution, more so than at any time. It stands to reason that the monks there in the monastery created this document to preserve themselves and safeguard themselves. In short, the monks at St. Catherine's Monastery in the 16th century needed protection from the marauding Muslims all around it. So they forged this letter and then added Muhammad's name to it to give it authority in order to safeguard their monastery. The fact that Muslims today, like John Morrow, are also using this document in the 21st century to support their narrative of a peaceful Islam is indeed rather ironic. That's the only place they can go to, is to come to a Christian document written for protection against the very Muslims that they needed to be protected against. And yet now the Muslims are claiming, oh, we need it too, not only because it's a great document for us to use as a standard, but because it proves Muhammad's existence in the 7th century. Let's then go to the Constitution Medina. I've got this video. It was uploaded on Fander Films on April 28th of this year. So you can see a much more detailed critique of this constitution. What is the Constitution, Medina? There it is on the right. Now, folks, I've had some Muslims get upset with me. That is not the original. That's nothing more than a facsimile. We cannot find the original. There is no original. Again, like everything, there's not original. It's nothing more than attributed. It's an attribution. But we do have the articles that are there if you want to read them. The Constitution of Medina was a document supposedly created by Muhammad when he first moved to Medina sometime between 622 and 624, the first 2 years he was there, according to the traditions. It was an agreement between the three major groups then in Medina, the Ansar, who were the native Arabs, the Jews, who were the native Jews that had lived there for hundreds of years, and Muhammad and the Muhajirun, who had just come and moved there from Mecca just that year in 622. Muslims consider it as a model for agreements today. It is the oldest constitution for mankind, they claim. It is the oldest example of a multi-faith, multiculturalism. Therefore, it's a great paradigm for what they call the Three Faiths Forum. It is an egalitarian document guaranteeing religious liberty and equality. Then can you understand why this has become so popular? And it's interesting, it's only really become popular since 9/11, since 2001. So it's really only the last 19 years that you're hearing people use this. We used to get it suddenly. It was introduced there at Speaker's Corner in the early part of the century, but primarily because the narrative of Islam changed completely. Beth, you can back me up on this, but when we were there in the 1990s, I remember Islam was not a religion of peace. They were not even concerned with that narrative. We got beat up, we got punched. It was very volatile. And then 9/11 happened, and immediately after 2001, or almost immediately within the next month, October of 2001, suddenly the narrative changed, and it suddenly became a religion of peace. And now that it was a religion of peace, they needed a document to support them. And suddenly this constitution started appearing all the time. They started bringing it forth. See, this is what real Islam is, because this is from the pen of Muhammad himself. This is his agreement with those Jews and with the Ansar there in Medina when he moved there in 622. That's why they want it, because it's a great paradigm. It's a great model. It fits the narrative post 9/11 for Islam. What's the content of it? Well, I'm not going to go through all the different articles. Basically, it says this, that Christians can gather anywhere and Muslims will protect their buildings. It says that no one can plunder Christians or destroy the churches or take anything from within. A Christian woman must give her consent before she marries a Muslim man, and that a Christian woman can marry Muslim men. They are free to go to their churches if they want to, that Christians can build and repair churches and convents, and that Christians must not participate in military, much like the letter to the Astronomy, they must not participate in the military. But everything else, and it is as benign as you can get. You can see why this is such an attractive document for Muslims today, because it fits not only in the 21st century, it's very politically correct, it's exactly what they would like to see, or what they like the world to see Islam really is. And that's one reason for its popularity. But there are problems. First of all, it is clearly pro-Jewish, yet there is no record of it in any Jewish historical documents. Why is it the Jews don't have this document, since it's so much favorable to them? There's no archaeological evidence for the existence of any Jews in Medina or its vicinity that early. We don't know of any Jews down that far south. The Jews, the furthest south they come to is Medina Saleh, which is much, much further north, about 400 miles further north. There are no Jews in Medina that we can find in the 7th century or that far south. It contradicts the Sirah and the Hadith treatment of Jews, which is much more cruel. So what happened? Did Muhammad was suddenly very benign, and then suddenly everyone went bad or sour? And more than that, take a look and see what it says about the Quran. It confronts the Quran categorically. The isnads for the Constitution are confused with different versions. First of all, why do they even need the isnads if you have a document in your hand? If you have the document, you don't need the isnads to give it authority. The Quran does not refer to any constitution in Medina. No Jew would sign a treaty, first of all, which gave Muhammad the authority between man and God. Look at the very first article. The very first article stipulates that Muhammad would be the arbitrator between man and God. What Jew would sign that? I wouldn't sign it. No Jew would sign that. And you can see the three major tribes never signed it. Their names are not on the document. The Banu Qurayza, the Banu Kanuka, the Banu Nadir, those three families are not, their names are not in that document. It doesn't appear until the Sirah of Ibn Hisham in 833, that's the 9th century, so much too late to be authentic. Notice that's the Abbasid period, so it doesn't appear until the Abbasids are in power. Muslims should be careful of accepting such a treaty as authentic, as it contradicts so much of the Quran's view of Jews. It's absolutely contradictory to the Quran. What are the scholars' conclusions then on this document? Robert Hoyland doubts its authenticity, saying there is not a single clearly Jewish inscription that has yet been found at Mecca, Yathrib, or Khaybar, despite quite a number of epigraphical surveys conducted at all three sites. It is only Muslim tradition that informs us of a Jewish community in Yathrib. And those Muslim traditions don't even come into play, aren't even written down or compiled or created until the 9th century. Frederick M. Denny says this: Ibn Ishaq preserved this ancient document, which does not appear in any other historical source. It seems to consist of separate documents from differing times in Medina. Now remember, when Denny says that, when he says Ibn Ishaq, he really means Ibn Ishaq, or we all mean Ibn Ishaq. We don't have Ibn Ishaq to know whether Ibn Ishaq said anything, but we do have Ibn Ishaq that quotes it. Dr. Pat Andrews concludes this: if there is no extant archaeological evidence for Jews in Yathrib, Medina, then it is impossible that the so-called Constitution of Medina is historically valid. Rather, it is legendary, apocryphal construct. So it would be, as he says, as if the 1812 war between the US and the UK was written in 2012. Or if the 1815 Battle of Waterloo was written in 2015, it's just written too late to be viable. What about the Doctrine of Iacobi? This is one that's been coming out in the last few weeks. An awful lot of Muslims are throwing it forward as a proof positive that Muhammad existed. I have a video on this, put it up on May 18th of this year on Fander Films. You can go and look on it and get much more detail than what I'm going to give here. Back then I had long hair because I hadn't had a haircut. You can see it was during the pandemic and there were no barbers available. So forgive me for my long hair. Now, the content of the Doctrine of Iacobi. The Doctrine of Iacobi is a Greek Christian polemical tract from Carthage, that's in Tunis today, but written in Palestine by a Christian apologist. Within the debate there that ensues in the passage, written by someone named Abraham, who relates some quite startling information concerning the appearance of a new prophet among the Saracens. I'm not going to read you the whole document. It would take too much time. Let me just read you this section that is important. And they were saying that the prophet had appeared coming with the Saracens. So let's talk about a prophet that comes with the Saracens, the Arabs, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the anointed one, the Christ who was to come. What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared to the Saracens? He asked him. And the response was, he is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. So I, Abraham, inquired and heard from those who had met him that there was no truth to be found in the so-called prophet, only the shedding of men's blood. He says also that he has the keys of paradise, which is incredible. In other words, is not credible. Those are the important parts of the document you need to look at. Why? Well, because there are problems with those. Number one, how can you have a Muslim prophet proclaiming the Christ was to come unless he was a Jewish Messiah? Because in the Quran in Surah 33:40, it says that the Muhammad is the last prophet. So how can you have one that yet to come after? That contradicts the Quran. This passage assumes Muhammad is still alive in 634, when the traditions say that he died in 632. That's the difficulty. So it confronts the traditional account. This prophet has the keys of paradise, which confronts the Islamic traditions. The prophet is more than likely a Jew, as it fits a Judeo-Christian monotheistic background. The anointed one to come, that is the Christ, which is Christos in Greek, or Mashiach in Hebrew, who was to come. But he has the keys of paradise. That comes from Matthew 16:19, referring to Peter's papal authority in the Catholic Church. He also spoke in Aramaic, not Arabic. Jews wouldn't know Arabic, and the Muhammad wouldn't have known Hebrew. So how would he have known Aramaic? And how would he have been able to, therefore, speak in that language? So what are the scholars' conclusions? Crone and Cook say that this testimony is, of course, irreconcilable with the Islamic account of the prophet's career. We have here older material, a stratum of belief older than the Islamic tradition itself. John Wansborough out of University of London, SOAS, says prophethood was a monotheistic constant, a basic belief, concrete examples of which arose in the area in every monotheistic religion. The specific manifestation, of course, differing from religion to religion. So therefore, every leader claimed to be a prophet in order to get credibility. So it stands to reason, he is saying, is I'm not surprised that someone would claim to be this prophet, since this is quite normal. At that time, most everybody did that. Nivo and Koran, they say this: the Doctrine of Iacobi provides no support for the identification of this prophet with Muhammad. In fact, if one thing is clear, it is that the account of the Doctrine of Iacobi does not describe the Muhammad that we know. He could more easily be almost anybody else. In these troubled years, there can have been no shortage of such prophets appealing to the various Christian and Jewish sects. Robert Spencer concludes saying, inasmuch as the keys of paradise are more akin to Peter's keys of the kingdom of heaven than to anything in Muhammad's message, the prophet in the Doctrine Jacobi seems closer to a Christian or Christian-influenced messianic millennialist than to the prophet of Islam as he is depicted in Islam's canonical literature. Conclusion, there is no reference to the name Muhammad, no reference to this prophet being a Muslim or belonging to the religion of Islam, nor any reference to the city of Mecca, nor of his book, the Quran. He sounds more like an Arab Christian brigand, employing the status of a prophet to gain himself more credibility and authority. There's just nothing Muslim about him. That's my conclusion. Now we get to Muhammad in the Quran. And this is a video that I put up with Murad on June 7th, which is fascinating because Murad speaks Aramaic, he speaks Arabic, he knows the traditions, he lives in the Middle East, is a native of that area, and he just kind of unpacks the Quran like no one else that I've met. And he really helped me go through these 4 verses. There are only 4 verses in the Quran that mention Muhammad by name in the Arabic. Now his name is in parentheses in the English translation because anytime you see the representative of God or the prophet of God, they put Muhammad's name after that. But it's not in the Arabic. The Arabic is only in chapter 3, verse 144, in chapter 33, verse 40, in chapter 47, verse 2, and chapter 48, verse 29. And Murad points out that none of them refer to a person called Muhammad at all. They most likely refer instead to the Blessed One, because that's what Muhammad means in Arabic. It means the Blessed One, who could very well have been Jesus. If you look and see, and you look at the context, I don't have time to do it, look at the video, look at the context, he goes through each one of those verses and show that in every case it could be Jesus, and it fits the context of that verse and also of that passage. The conclusion, if this is correct, then Muslims cannot use the Quran to support Muhammad's existence in the 7th century. And one of the foundational pillars of Islam begins to fall. Well, what about the Dome of the Rock? Because the Dome of the Rock also has inscriptions that have Muhammad's name in. The Shahada is introduced on the Dome of the Rock. It's also introduced on coins. It's also introduced on the protocols, the Caliphal protocol. So in 3 different places between 691 and 692, Abdul Malik introduces it. Could that be the Muhammad that we're looking for? Now, I put this video up. That has gone, over 70,000 people have watched this video. It has been so popular. This I did with Murad as well. I put this up on June 9th. Fascinating, because that was the day after the whole thing blew up on the Kiddots. So June 9th, that video, go ahead and look at it on Fander Films. Both Mel and Murad came and helped me out, but Murad did most of the work on this. We've always assumed that the inscription of the Dome of the Rock, built in 690 referred to Muhammad, and that it was here that the Shahada was first introduced by Abdul Malik. I've said this. You've heard me say it. I know Beth has said this many times. We have always assumed that that is the case because those are the earliest Quranic references we have on those inscriptions, on the inner ambulatories that you see there where the 2 green arrows are pointing. But Mel from Speaker's Corner and Murad from the Middle East choose to disagree. Much like Muhammad's name in the Quran, these inscriptions do not refer to a man named Muhammad at all, but to the Blessed One who could very well be Jesus. Much like we saw in the Quran, the same thing exists on these inscriptions. The Quranic verses in these inscriptions are not the same as that which we have in the Quran today, and are thus possibly precursors to the Quranic verses which were written later. Conclusion? If this is correct, there's no reason for me to doubt what Murad is saying. Then Muslims cannot use the Dome of the Rock to support Muhammad's existence in the 7th century, and one of the foundational pillars of Islam begins to fall even further. Now, I know the comeback I'm going to get, I'm sure you're going to write this as a question. Well, then, when did Muhammad, when was he finally chosen as the prophet that we now know about in the traditions? It looks like, and this is what Murad's finding, this is what Mel's finding, this is what Robert Spencer has now agreed upon. We had a great talk about this, and if you look at that video that I did with him, it looks like this Muhammad of the man himself is introduced in 730. The Muhammad that is there, the Blessed One of God, then becomes and is stipulated and is pointed to a man himself, possibly around 730. That's a good 30 years after Abdul Malik. So who is then this Ilyas ibn Qabisa of Tayaye? Take a look at the video that I just put up on August 29th. This video, we really go into and look and unpack who Qabisa al-Tayayi. Let me just review a little bit of what that video says. Looking for the vanishing Muhammad. We just can't find him in the 7th century. The traditions say that Muhammad lived in the Hijaz, and he, along with those who came after, led an invasion against the Byzantines in the north and the Persians in the east. So he was significant for that time. He must have been known. If he did that much, if he was that far and he was that great, and those who came after Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, if they controlled from the land all the way from Tripoli in the west, all the way to Afghanistan in the east, if all that land was under control, someone should have known about them. Someone should have heard about them. Yet we can't find anything written about him nor his conquests outside of the traditions. But we do find a man named Muhammad. There is somebody called Muhammad referred to in documents from the 7th century, including the fragments of the chart of Jacob of Edessa in 692, the Ad Anum of 705, the Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 741 that we're going to talk about later, the Zupnin Chronicle of 775, and Thomas the Presbyterian in 640 approximately says that this Muhammad was the leader of the Tayyaye. So we do know that there was a man named Muhammad who was given this name. Oh, hold on a minute, maybe not quite this name. His nickname. Okay, let's go with that. So who was this Muhammad? They all suggest that this Muhammad was a king and had a lot of authority. To understand who this person was, we need to go back to 618 and look for a rebel leader in that year. The Hispanic Chronicle of 754 says that the Saracens rebelled in 618 and took Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia for themselves. So now the Saracens are in control of that area. The Arabs then selected a king 4 years later in 622 so that he would unite them against the Saracens. Look at the date, 622, hugely significant. John Bar Benkaya of 690 and the Chronicle of Fredegar in 715 mentioned they had two leaders at this time. So we need to find two leaders who jointly lead. Possibly one could be Muawiyah of Damascus in the west, and the other could be Ali of Hira in the east. The Westerners called the Umayyads one. So Muawiyah now controlled his Persian and Roman subject, and he does that and wins and comes to power in 661. So we are looking for a Lakhmid king from 618, much earlier than Muawiyah, who became a rebel, ideally as someone who was kicked out of a city, for example, Hira, close to that year, from which to create the Hijrah out of Mecca legend later on, and who later reconquered that city. Who then is this Lakhmid king? Because that's the area we're looking at, the Lakhmid kingdom. Did he have a name? In the 9th century, Al-Bukhari, in the traditions, refers to Muhammad as Ibn Abi Kabsha, son of the father of the sheep. The leader of the Tayyaye, which is the Lakhmid area, is referred to as Ilyas ibn Kabisa al-Tayyaye, which is his official name. Look at Ibn Abi Kabsha and Ibn Kabisa. Look how similar they are. Muhammad, however, was his nickname, or his nom de guerre, his known for military use. Note how close Ibn Abi Kabsha, from Bukhari's reference to him in the 9th century, and Ilyas ibn Kabisa, his name in the 7th century are. Are you seeing that? Khosrau, the Sasanian king, needed someone in the Lakhmid area in Hira to control the Lakhmids from raiding his territory. So he appoints Ilyas ibn Kabisa as the first and last non-Lakhmid governor in Hira between 602 and 617 and gave him 30 villages along the Euphrates, but Kabisa rebelled and joined the Arabs and was deposed. Kabisa, once deposed, became a rebel leader for the Arabs in 622. There's the date, 622 again, and led them against the Sassanids. Thus, the reason 622 was chosen later on as Muhammad's hijrah from Mecca to Medina, because the Arab identity began then. That's why 622 is so important. That's when the Arabs finally come into their own. The 7th century Muhammad was of a high status and not poor, as the traditions intimate, who then moved to the west close to Jordan, Petra, perhaps. So it seems that the later traditions have the wrong Muhammad, as the real Muhammad lived much further north, was wealthy, and is credited with beginning the Arab rebellion against the Sassanians and the Byzantines around 622 AD. Now, let's put him in a lamp so you can see what I'm talking about. Where did he come from? Well, first of all, he came from Kufa, which was known as Hira. Kufa is the name today. Kufa then became very important in the 8th century as a land, as the city where the Qurans were being created. But Kabisa comes from that area, and that's the Lakhmid kingdom. There you can see in the red rectangle. Remember, I put it in red because it is considered to be anathema to traditions. It is against the tradition. That's the capital of the Lakhmid kingdom, Hira. Once deposed, he then moves to Jordan, possibly Petra to the west. Note how far north both Kufa and Petra are from the Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are situated. The Islamic traditions stipulate that Muhammad was born and lived his whole life in the Hijaz, in the green rectangle down there. Yet the historical Muhammad is not from there at all, but from much further north. Are you seeing the same pattern coming up over and over and over again? Since that is a problem, let's go look at the place. And this is number 4 category. Let's now look at the place. Let's now look and see where we're going to, where Islam began, not when it began or who it began with. Now let's look at where it began. What Muslims claim? Well, they claim that Mecca is the oldest and best known city in history. Mecca is where Adam and Eve were thrown down to from the Garden of Eden. That's in chapter 7, verse 24 of the Quran. Mecca is where Abraham lived when he destroyed the idols within the Kaaba. That's in chapter 21 of the Quran, verses 51 to 71. And Mecca is the center of the trade route north, south, east, and west, according to Montgomery Watt's trade route theory that we talked about last week and the week before. So it should be one of the best known and best documented places in history, just because it's been there from the very beginning. If Adam and Eve went there, that's the very first settlement in history of mankind. If certainly Abraham lived there, it was there in 1900 BC, and if it was north, south, east, and west center of all the trade routes, then it should be well known in the 7th century. So let's then start with the 4 rightly guided caliphs. This is the video I put up with Mel on June 5th of this year. Take a look at the rightly guided, because we confronted this whole notion whether or not they even existed. We've not been able to find the Muhammad of the 9th century. So can we find anyone else that was with him, that were surrounded by him or around him? Let's start with the term caliph. There are no rock inscriptions in the 7th century which use the term khalif. The term which was used was Amir al-Mu'minin, which means commander of the faithful, which does not even denote a sense of a successor. The term Khalif was a shortening of the Khalifat Rasul Allah and meant successor of the Messenger of God. What about any reference to these first 4 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, that we know about in the traditions? They are the ones that come from 632 to 634, 634 to 644, from 644 to 656, and then from 656 to 661. That's where their dates are for those 4 caliphs. The historicity of the first caliphs is seriously in doubt. Attempts at getting their story straight have failed. Abu Bakr couldn't have been a caliph, as contradictory evidence rules that out. Ummah's historicity rests on one rock inscription that could be about anyone of that name. Ali was never a caliph, and he died 3 years before his reign, which was meant to have ended. This is all in the video. I'm not unpacking it for you today. What is interesting is there is reference to these 4 names, but those 4 names are well known all over that part of the world and at that time. But not one of them is a caliph, and not one of them has any reference to them. What's even more interesting, we can't find any coins with their names on it. All the coins, I'm not even getting to the coin on this lecture, because that you did 3 weeks ago. The coins do not refer to any caliph until 661, after these 4 are already gone and dead, if they even existed. So where do we get these 4 caliphs from? They only come into existence in the Islamic traditions much, much too late and too far away. What about the rock inscriptions? This is another video that I put up on August 24th on Fander Films. Go and look at it. It's up there. To talk about the rock inscriptions, what a benefit they have given us. We'd never looked at the rock inscription before. Shame on us. Why didn't we look at the rock inscriptions? Shame on us for not looking at the coins. Because if we're not going to cry out, the rocks will cry out for us, including the coins. Why are they so important? Rock inscriptions are one of the best ways to know of a period in history, because they are durable and they are plentiful. If the classical accounts concerning the emergence of Islam were true, then there should be a lot written on the inscriptions about Mecca, about Muhammad, about Islam, about the Muslims, about the Quran itself, because according to the Islamic traditions from the 9th and 10th century, Muhammad and Islam were very big in that area of the world and during that time, yet we don't find anything at all for these 5 areas, especially on the rock inscriptions from that century. Now, there are 3 ways to date rock inscriptions. The first way is by the inscriber himself, who is hired to write them. They either put a date themselves so that similarly written inscriptions could be dated in a group, or they are dated by the evolution of theological ideas within them. Earlier ones have little to no theology, while later ones will have more and better developed theology. And then you also look at the script. The evolution of the script within them also is used to date them. So you can see how the script goes from the Mu'il to the more Abbasid script, which is much more stylized. And so that's why we can date them pretty accurately, not always, but pretty accurately. Now, there are many inscriptions, but they're all in the wrong language. 30,000 rock inscriptions have been cataloged so far in all the work that has been done and surveyed across the Arabia, the Negev, the Transjordan, and Syria, with possibly another 70,000 yet to do. So we're not even halfway through it, those who are doing it. I'm not doing this, don't worry. Wouldn't even begin to do this. It would be much way over my head, outside of my comfort zone, and I'm just too dumb to do this kind of stuff. One would expect Muhammad's name on the inscriptions along the Hajj routes, yet we don't find one inscription with Muhammad's name on it at all until 690. Until 690. Look at that date. Who's in power at 690? What happens in 690, 691, and 692? South of Medina, the script is Sabaik, originating in Yemen, created in 600 BC and continued for 1200 years. That's that rectangle in red. That is the Sabaik language. What's the Sabaik script? Which is interesting because the Sabaik script, here's the irony. The Sabaik script had dots and vowels already in it. If those who were in that area, and look, we're talking about Mecca. Mecca is in that area. It's just from Medina on south is where the Sabaik script is being used in the 7th century up until, it went up from 6th century BC up until the 7th century AD. And what's fascinating, when you look at the dots and the vowels that are in that script, if the Quran had been written in the 7th century, like the traditions tell us, it would have used that script. And if it had used that script, which comes from Yemen, way down in the south, that's where it was mostly used. If it had used that script, if a guy named Muhammad or whoever, Zayd ibn Thabit or Uthman had used the Sabaik script, there would have been no problems with the Qira'ats. We would have had no Qira'at controversy. There would not be this huge storm all over the world because the dots and the vowels were already there. They could have used that script. The fact that they did not use that script means the Quran did not come from that part of the world. It must have come from further north. Why? Well, we know that the Arabic script that we have in the Quran today comes from the Nabatean Aramaic script, which is only found in the north, when the other rectangle that you say way up the top there. That is where the Quran comes from. And that Arabic that was derived from the Nabatean Aramaic script did not have dots and did not have vowels. That's why we have all the problems that we have today. And that's why you have 30 official Qurans today, because everybody had their own idea as to where they're going to put those dots and where they're going to put those vowels. What an irony! This is what's fascinating about this whole study. They got the wrong book, the wrong language in the wrong place at the wrong time. They should have stuck, if they were even there, proving that there was no Quran, there was no Islam, there was no Muhammad that far south, because they would have had the best script in the world to use had it been from that area. Oh, I love it. And it just makes my job so much easier. Now, let's take a look, and you'll see why. Let's put it on a graph. I want to put it on a timeline, because it really helps you really zone in as to why this is so important, these rock inscriptions. Ilka Lindstedt is one who's done the most work on these rock inscriptions, and he dated over 100 of these rock inscriptions between 640 and 740. These are the earliest ones that you could find. Again, there's many more yet to do, so there's still more yet to come. What he found was this, from 640 to 740, so that 100-year period is where he dated this rock inscription. But take a look. This is the period directly after Muhammad died, and of course, right up until the Abbasids come into power. So this covers the entire Umayyad dynasty. Now, prior to 690, he knows there was no evidence of anything Islamic on all the inscriptions. Lo and behold, that's just like the coins. There's nothing Islamic on any of the coins. There's also nothing Islamic on any of the inscriptions. That's what he found. Everything comes after 690. So all the reference we have now to Muhammad, to Mecca, reference we have to the Quran, to these people called Muslims or anything called Islamic, these 5 areas that we're looking for, they all come after 690. Before 690, you have nothing more than what they call pious formulae. And if you look at the pious formulae, you will notice that they have a Bismillah, but it's not the Bismillah that is used in the Quran today. It is much more generic, and the Bismillah use the word Allah because Allah is a Nabatean God. So it stands to reason because that was the only name for God found in Arabic that early, or you might say that late. So that anything from is nothing more than formulae, but it's not the formula of the Quran. From 690 to 710, the Prophet Muhammad appears. We see this on the inscriptions. We also see it on the coins. We also see it on the Dome of the Rock, introduced by Abdul Malik himself. Then from 710 to 720, Muslim rites begin to appear. The pilgrimage is now introduced. Prayers are now introduced. The fast. We now find the 5 pillars of Islam start to be introduced after 710 and up to 720, that 10-year period. Interesting, interesting. That's why you don't find that the same prayers are the pilgrimage in the Quran that you find now in the Islamic traditions. And then it's not till from 720 to 730 that the names Muslim in Islam refer to a specific group, in contradistinction to Christianity. This is when Islam now takes its identity. This is where Islam now comes into its own, between 720 and 730. That's where also, I should have added to this, that's where the name Muhammad now takes on a new role. And now he is a person who is a prophet who had something to do with 622. It's all introduced from 720 to 730. Folks, can you see why that's important? It was only in the 730s onwards that there is evidence of popular devotion to Muhammad as a prophet and messenger, which makes the Islamic traditions incredibly awkward, because this is a good 100 years too late. It's 100 years too late. The inscriptions are just like the coins are showing us that we have nothing at all. The Islamic traditions have nothing at all to support, which proves now that we are not arguing from silence. We now have the coins and we have the inscriptions to back us up. Oh, I love this. Can you see how it makes my job so easy? More than that, there is 100-year silence prior to this that indicates that Islam did not exist as a distinct religion until long after the time of Muhammad, which casts doubt on whether he had any part in starting Islam. Now, when any Muslim comes up to me and says, we know who Muhammad was, we know what he did, we know what he said, we know where he lived, we know how he lived, all of this, I'm going to say, no, you're arguing from silence. You have nothing to support what you just said. And it's now the Muslims who are arguing from silence. I no longer am arguing from silence. You are no longer arguing from silence. I hope you're getting this. This is why this is so damaging, because it's now evidence that's on the ground from the 7th and 8th century up until in this case, up until the early part of the 8th century. Now, let's go then to the Hijrah. This is the video I did on the Hijrah with Mel and Murad there on September the 13th, not too many days, just about a little over a month ago on the Hijrah, because this is also interesting. To understand this date, you need to look at what was happening historically. In 614, the Persians defeated the Byzantines. In 622, the Byzantines under Heraclius came and defeated the Persians. And that's why we think this Ibn al-Qadisa now rebelled against the Persians and joined the Arabs, because he was an Arab himself, because of what Heraclius did. Most people aren't looking and seeing what's happening historically. You've got to see what's happening historically on the ground. The Arabs rejoiced because they were Christian Arabs, not Muslims, and they were happy that the Byzantines had finally destroyed the Persians who had persecuted them as Christian Arabs for centuries. Thus, the year 622 is important from then on, as it is the date that Arabs finally were free to create their own identity. So why create the story of the Hijrah of Muhammad moving in 622 from Mecca and Medina later on? Why create this story? Well, in Ibn Ishaq in 765, he was from the Abbasid period. He is the first to write down about the Hijrah, so he's the first one to even note it. This was then rewritten by Ibn Hisham in 833. This is why this is also within the Abbasid era, and that's why I say forget about Ibn Ishaq, go to Ibn Hisham. The Abbasids hated the Umayyads and sought to eradicate much of their history, including these battles. They instead introduced new stories surrounding the Prophet Muhammad, including this one in 622. But instead of referring to the defeat of the Persians by the Byzantines, which they didn't want to give any credit to, they created an entirely new narrative around Muhammad, having him move from one city to the other. Why? Murad suggests they did this to create their own prophets, similar to but superior to the prophets of the Christians and Jews. Remember, they wanted to create their own identity. They were Arabs, like so were the Jews and the Christians were Arabs. The problem with the Jews and Christians had a prophetic line. These Arabs did not. The Abbasids did not have a prophetic line. The Jews and Christians also had a book. The other Arabs, these other Abrahamic Arabs who were Nabatean in descent, they are from the line of Ishmael. They call themselves Ishmaelites. They call themselves Hagarites. They did not have a book. So they didn't have a book. They didn't have a prophetic tradition. That's why they didn't introduce it. But if you're going to put a tradition about this prophet, you're going to have a story around him. So Muhammad's biography follows similar stories taken from the Bible of the biblical prophets and transfer them onto Muhammad, especially those of Moses, including this one of his persecution, followed by an exodus. And later on, even entering Medina, similar to that of another prophet named Jesus, who enters Jerusalem. So can you see what's going on? They need to have that tradition. fit their prophet. That's why he didn't give a story. Can you then understand why the story about Muhammad, everything he did, everything he said, comes from the 9th century, much, much later, 240 years, or in case 200 to 240 years too late. All too late later, because that's when they finally are now creating the story around, the narrative around this prophet, and a narrative around his book. Now let's go to the 741 inscription. This is the inscription that became famous when Patricia Corona announced it. I did a film on this on September 18th. You can go up and see that there on Fander Films. What is this 741 AD inscription? Well, it's also known as the Byzantine Arabic Chronicle of 741. This is the chronicle that Patricia Corona says has the first reference that we can find anywhere of the word Mecca. So therefore, Mecca could not have existed prior to 741. But she still didn't get it right. I mean, God bless her. She did a great job. She just didn't read the rest of the inscription. You need to read the entire inscription. And it says this: Abdul Malik is the word that is his name, assuming the apex of his kingdom, ruled for 20 years. In the first year of his rule, he directed all the experience and virtue of the mind of his army against Abdullah, that's Abdul Zubair, whom his father had attacked so many times in various wars. Remember, his father only ruled for 1 year, from 680 to 680, well, from 684 to 685, all the way finally to Mecca, as they consider it the home of Abraham. Now, Mecca is the home of Abraham, according to the tradition, which lies in the desert between Ur of the Chaldeans and Kara of the city of Mesopotamia. See, Patricia Corona only looked at the word Mecca and stopped there. She should have read on, continued. The chronicler describes exactly where this is. He describes it. It's in Ur of the Chaldeans, Kara, the city of Mesopotamia. Now, you might say, hold on, Jay. Ur is in Iraq. I say, yes, it is today. It is in today because it was discovered in 1853 by J.E. Taylor, the British archaeologist who discovered it. But that's in 853. We didn't know that Ur was in Iraq until 1853. This is 741. This is over 1,000 years earlier. 1,000 years earlier in the 8th century, they didn't know where Ur was. They assumed that Ur was way up there in southern Turkey, near where Jacob Edessa comes from. And Jacob Edessa refers to the Ur. So that's why you need to look and see what's happening in the 8th century, not in the 19th century. So for as far as they were concerned, back at this time in the 8th century, Ur, Mecca, just south of Ur, between Edessa and Haram, the town of Abraham's brother. Now, look at the 741 Chronicle, and let's look at it on a map. This is from Mel's PowerPoint, so I asked him if I could borrow it. There you can see Ur of Edessa. There it is, and where Mecca is. So Mecca is way up there. This is the first Mecca. It's halfway between Edessa and Haran. If you look at the map of Turkey, you can see where it is. It's Sanliofa Merkezi. My sister knows all about it. I talked to her about it. I said, Jay, we've been there. We used to go there. So she knows all about it. That's the name, the name today. That was the original Mecca. There you can see a map of Turkey on the far left. You can see it's in the southern part of Turkey today. When they, that is the Abbasids, relocated the Kaaba further south, they built it directly south of the old Mecca. The new Mecca would have the Kaaba and be the place that the Qiblas began to be directed towards. That's why the red arrow is going straight down, south, straight line coming south from Ur. Now, at the same time, and here's what's really fascinating, an inscription was uncovered and was noted. In fact, Muslims know about this. Islamic Awareness website has this inscription, even has that picture of it, that is dated about 697 to 698 AD. 697, 698 AD. Remember, this is the time of Abdul Malik. This is during the time of Abdul Malik's reign. This was written in the year the Masjid al-Haram was built, in the 78th year. The Masjid al-Haram was built. That's what it says on the inscription. If we can assume that this inscription which is located 75 kilometers from Mecca, on the route to Taif, where it refers to the site of the Masjid al-Haram, which later became Mecca in Hijaz, then this would be interesting, as it is directly due south of the old Mecca in Mesopotamia. And that's why this inscription has become such a thorn in the side of Islam. Interestingly, that picture of that rock with that inscription has now been destroyed. It was just destroyed in the last 2 years. It looks like the Arabs know that this is incriminating. It incriminates the whole history of where Mecca came into being. And that's why they've now destroyed it. But we've got it in pictures, so we know it exists, or it did exist. I want you to show you the sequence of what we're talking about. In 697, you have this inscription. There is Taif. It's just southeast of what Mecca is today, indicating the building called the Al-Masjid al-Haram. That means the place of bowing, the holy or the forbidden place of bowing. This is close to the place that later became known as Mecca, the Hijaz, but it was not yet called Mecca, not that early. In 741, the first Mecca was still located just below Ur, the birthplace of Abraham. And then in 754, the Masjid al-Haram, the Kaaba, the Qibla direction in Mecca, number 2, are all fused, conflated, and together at the site of Mecca, the Hijaz, under the direction of al-Mansur, who ruled from 754 to 775. Who did a major construction in that year. The original Mecca, therefore, was located in southern Turkey, in Ur, south of Edessa. It is much too far north, once again, but directly above the present and current second Mecca. Now we go to Petra versus Mecca. This is a video I put up on October the 2nd this month, just a little bit earlier. You can go up and see it. That when we do a whole sequence, and I go back and forth comparing two. Let's remind ourselves of Petra versus Jordan. Now remember, this is so you don't get confused. Are we conflicting the two? No, we're not. They're not conflicting. They're complementary and sequential. Iraq concerns politics, the Quran, and the theological debates. Petra in Jordan concerns really only the Qiblas, the direction of prayer in the mosques. Iraq both precedes Petra and returns following Petra. So therefore, Iraq is important for the years 577 to 636. That's the quest for Muhammad. That's what we're doing today. Petra is important from 626 to 727. That's the Qibla. That's Dan Gibson's material that we did earlier. Iraq then becomes important again from 736 onwards. That's the Qurans and the Qira'ats that we did the last 2 weeks. So when you look at Iraq and Petra, you'll see that we're bouncing back and forth because it depends on what area and what time period we're looking at. So let's look at Petra and Mecca, and one preceding other. Do not look them as conflicting, but complementary. The need for a place was already in place. Petra has all the stations of the pilgrimage, which are now in Mecca. A square center, the Kaaba, with the exact dimensions mentioned by Al-Zaraqi in the traditions, which do not fit the present-day Kaaba. The Safa and Marwa mountains that they run back and forth and trying to commemorate what Hagar was doing when she was looking for water, are in Petra, with places for idols on the top and not little rocks just 15 feet high that you see in Mecca today. Those are nothing more than facsimiles. They're nothing more than little stones that they put there to symbolize those two mountains. Those mountains do exist, and they are in Petra. The washing of water with the cisterns and waterways are only found in Petra, not in Mecca, which only has one well, the Zamzam well. The plain in Muzdalifah, a slippery slope mountain with a mosque and a church at the top, and where 5,000 people could easily pray, is again only found in Petra. And then the Jamarat platform with the pillar to throw either 49 or 72 stones at is found in Petra, and it's only one Jamarat, not the 3 platforms that you find in Mecca today, suggesting 3 devils when you know there's only one devil. So you can see from all this, you can see it's very clear that Petra is the better place for the whole traditions of the Hajj that we know. Dan Gibson's conclusion on Petra: traditions tell us that Mecca is in a valley, yet Mecca isn't, while Petra is. The Thanea cliffs are not in Mecca, but they can be found extensively in Petra. The Quranic god Allah and the goddess Alat and Al-Uzza are found in chapter 53, verse 19 and 20 in the Quran are uniquely from Petra, not Mecca. All the stations on the pilgrimage referred to in the earliest texts are found in Petra. In fact, everything the Quran and traditions speak of can be found in Petra and are more realistic and more historical. So when you look on a map, notice where Petra is. Petra is the ancient sanctuary city of the tombs and temples for the Nabateans. It is on the trade routes east and west and north. Notice that none of them going south. Mecca isn't on any international trade route because of the Red Sea. And that's the whole problem with Montgomery Watt's trade route theory. And this is why Patricia Crone just destroyed that theory by showing that the trade was maritime. It was entirely maritime, going across the Arabian Sea and then going up the Red Sea, where the 2 arrows are there. Petra is where the Nabatean Aramaic was spoken and written, which later gave birth to Quranic Arabic. Petra is where all the mosques up to 706 are facing. I don't have time to go into that. You can go and see that from upon Fander Films. I put that up about 3 weeks ago. As far away as Canton in China and Sherman in India, up until 706, all the mosques are facing Petra. Not one of them is facing Mecca until 727. So it seems that Petra seems to have been the original Mecca. Petra is much too far north to support the later traditions, once again. Now we come to conclusions, and I see that I have gone way over time. It's 1 o'clock. We started at 10:30. I've gone 2.5 hours. Still, we're going to put it up to questions. Let's find and let's get our conclusions. What are our conclusions? Well, let's show a map once again. Let's look at the dominance of the north in almost everything we're saying. Mecca and Medina do not have any manuscripts. The north have 6 to 9 manuscripts of the earliest manuscripts. Mecca and Medina only have 8 qira'ats, whereas the north has 22 qira'ats. Mecca and Medina have no canonical Quran, whereas the north gave us the final Hafs Quran, the one that we're now using today. Mecca and Medina have no Quranic Arabic. The north is where you find the Quranic Arabic. That's where it was created. Mecca and Medina have no Qiblas until 727. The north is where all the Qiblas are faced up until 706, all facing Petra. Mecca and Medina have the wrong Muhammad. The north has the correct Muhammad, the historical Muhammad, the Ilyas ibn Qabisa, whose nickname is Muhammad. Isn't that interesting? That's his nickname. His formal name was Ilyas ibn Qabisa, and he is the one that rebels against the Sassanians and then turns and joins with the Arabs in 622 to create their identity. Mecca, Medina, no rock inscriptions whatsoever. They're all up in the north, and all the ones that are pre-Islamic are up in the north. Mecca, Medina have no hijrah. It's the north that created the hijrah and created it, and that's why 622 date is important. Mecca, Medina gave us the second Mecca, whereas it's the north that gave us the first Mecca. Mecca, Medina has no ancient sanctuary. The north had the original sanctuary. Conclusion, almost everything we know about Islam today came primarily from the north. Note, all of those areas in red, notice all those dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, except Cairo, are where the Abbasids originated from. This is all Abbasid territory, and this all comes into existence from 622 up until 749. And in 749, the whole narrative is now introduced in that area, much too far north, much too far away, and much too far in time. So, conclusions concerning early Islam. The sources for everything we know about traditional Islam came too late and from too far away. Except for the first canonization, which is impossible to find, the other 4 canons are too far north: Cairo, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra, thus all in either Egypt, Syria, or Iraq. The earliest Quranic manuscripts are much too late, the 8th and 9th century, with none of them which are complete nor the same, while some include hundreds and other thousands of manuscript variants. The Quranic Arabic is derived from Nabatean Aramaic, which is, again, much too far north. The Ashtanami letter is not from the 7th century, but from the 16th century, thus much too late. The Constitution Medina is not from the 7th century, but from the 9th century, again, much too late. The doctrine of Iacobi refers to the wrong man at the wrong place and from the wrong time. Muhammad is not in the Quran, nor is he in the inscription of the Dome of the Rock. Much more, it looks like Ilyas ibn Qabisa of Tayaye may be the 7th century Muhammad the later traditions borrowed. We can't find any of the 4 rightly guided caliphs in the 7th century at all, which is odd. And the rock inscriptions prior to 690 say nothing about Islam, Muhammad, Mecca, the Quran, or about Muslims. These only begin to appear after 690 and are finally introduced as we know it today between 720 and 730. The Islam we have today really start to begin to introduce between 720 and 730, and then is finalized with all its traditions and all its theology during the Abbasid area, and including its stories of Muhammad and how Islam began. The Hijrah of 622 was simply a later redaction by the Abbasids onto an earlier battle won by Heraclius for the Arabs, yet recognized as the year of the Arabs, where they finally created their own identity. The 741 inscription is the first reference to Mecca, yet places it below Edessa in southern Turkey. Petra was the initial sanctuary for the Arabs, which was later replaced by the current Mecca. The conclusion is, the historical record suggests that most everything we now know of Islam in the 7th century is either too far north or too far away or much too late to be the Islam of the 9th century Islamic traditions. My final conclusion is that Islam is nothing more than really an Abbasid creation. Too far, distant, too far, south, and too late. Okay, that should do it. Listen, I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions. This has been great being with you. This is our last talk. Let me just finish with this one last slide. By casting doubt on Islam, our Muslim friends can consider a better faith, the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Everything that I have used today, and I've been using the last 4 weeks, historical criticism, textual criticism, redacted criticism, source criticism, all these criticisms, this critical analysis called historical criticism under that umbrella, have all been applied to the Bible. They have all been applied to Jesus Christ. But really, historical criticism got its ascendancy, cut its teeth on biblical criticism. That's why we know about these criticisms. It was really the biblical scholars who took all of this, applied it to the Bible, and that's why in the last 100 years we've been able to answer every one of those criticisms. And only the Bible has passed every one of those criticisms. We don't have a problem with who Jesus was. We don't have a problem with where the Bible was written. We don't have a problem of how Christianity was created, how it emerged. No one really suggests that there was no Jesus in the first century. No one really suggests that the Bible did not begin to appear in its earliest manuscripts. Oh, there are some that would like to try to suggest that. But because of the fact that we have gone through every one of these tests and passed every one of them, gives us support for our Bible. That has not been done to Islam. We're just now getting to these kind of criticisms, these historical criticisms, the very criticisms that the Muslims should have been doing for the last 1400 years and have refused to do so, even today still refuse to do so, still makes claims which they cannot support, and still are being hung by their own inaccuracies. That's what happened on June the 8th, just 4 months ago. Folks, this material is so devastating. I believe this is always will be and has been the Achilles heel of Islam. I've said this from the very beginning when I first started working in this back in 1995. That's 25 years ago. When I first started getting into historical criticism, I said, this is the Achilles heel. This is what's going to destroy Islam. We're starting to see that happen in 2020. And this is just the beginning. This lecture that I'm doing today, I'll do a completely new lecture in just 1 year and a year after that, because so much new material is coming to play. We're learning so much about Islam, and it's not good for the Islamic traditions. It's not good for the Islamic narrative. That narrative, we pretty much can throw it away. We don't need it anymore. We need to look at the 7th century, and what we're finding there is not the same Islam, is not the same Muhammad, is not the same Quran, is not the same Mecca. It's not even the same religion. It's completely two different paradigms, two different narratives. It's been good being with you. It's been good having you on board. And listen, I look forward to your comments and also to your questions. Okay, this is Jay. Over and out. Questions. This has been a great 5 weeks. I've enjoyed the time with you. As we're going to do, looks like we'll do this again next year. And Steve, if it's okay with you, we'll just do another 5 lectures, and will be the addendum to these 5 lectures, and do it on a yearly basis so that we can get all the information out there so that you can use it in your own locale. Folks, we'll see you all later. I've got to go get something to eat. My wife is waiting for me. We've got to go, and my son's just got back from work, so they've been waiting for me to get through so we can go ahead. We'll see you all next year. God bless.
Bless you.